The silver captain's bars felt like two pieces of jagged glass against Elena Vance's collar when Colonel Marcus Thorne leaned in, his shadow eclipsing the Texas sun, and told her that the only reason she wasn't still a first lieutenant was because the Army's administrative clerks had finally mastered the art of the clerical error. He didn't say it loudly. He didn't have to. The humidity at Fort Valor was thick enough to carry a whisper like a physical weight, and as he stepped back, the sweat already beaded on his upper lip, Elena kept her eyes locked on a point exactly 3 inches above his head. She didn't blink. She didn't twitch. She stood on the parched parade deck, the smell of scorched Bermuda grass and stale diesel exhaust clinging to her fatigues, and felt the specific, cold pulse of her own heartbeat. Behind Thorne, the rest of the 402nd Military Police Battalion stood at a loose version of attention, the younger enlisted soldiers squinting against the glare of the San Antonio sky. They had heard it. Most of them would forget it by the time they hit the mess hall for lunch. But Elena stored the comment in the same place. She kept the coordinates for every rally point on the base and the serial number of every weapon in the armory. She stored it as data. Elena Vance was 32 years old, and she was made of Steubenville, Ohio. It was a town where the steel mills didn't just provide jobs. They provided the soot that settled in the lungs of every child born within 10 miles of the Ohio River. Her father, Pete, had been a shift foreman during the 1998 strike, a man who could look at a line of 500 screaming workers and tell you, without checking his watch, exactly which one was about to throw the first rock. He had taught Elena that people were like the steel they poured. They had a melting point, a breaking point, and a point where they simply became slag. He called it the sight. It wasn't psychic. It was just the brutal, practiced observation of human pressure. Elena had used that sight to navigate the bars of Steubenville, the cadet ranks at West Point, and 2 tours in the sandbox where the pressure was measured in wides and the silence of a village before an ambush. But here at Fort Valor, the pressure was different. It was bureaucratic. It was quiet. It was the sound of a career officer like Thorne deciding that a woman with a penchant for psychological mapping and pattern recognition was a liability in a world that preferred the blunt force of a riot shield. She walked away from the promotion ceremony with the bars pinned to her chest and a heavy, familiar sense of isolation. Her office was a repurposed supply closet in the back of the MP headquarters, a room that smelled of industrial floor wax and old coffee. She didn't mind the smallness of it. In a small room, you could control the variables. She sat down, her fingers moving to the edge of her desk where she had taped a topographical map of the base's perimeter. Fort Valor was a massive, sprawling entity, a city within a city, separated from the town of Oakhaven by a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with triple-strand concertina wire. For months, the tension in Oakhaven had been rising like a fever. A local shooting involving a civilian and a soldier off-duty had ignited a dry forest of resentment, and Elena had been watching the smoke. She didn't look at the news reports or the official intelligence briefings from the S2. She looked at the things the Army ignored. She looked at the sales records of the hardware store 3 blocks from the main gate. She looked at the frequency of spray-painted tags on the concrete overpasses. She looked at the way the local kids stopped playing basketball when the MP patrols drove by. She saw the patterns. To Thorne and the rest of the command staff, the upcoming Unity rally was just another weekend of extra gate guards and a few potential drunks. To Elena, it was a kinetic event waiting for a trigger. She could feel the hum of the base, a low-frequency vibration of thousands of people pretending things were normal while the air outside the wire turned electric. Staff Sergeant Kalen Miller pushed open the door to her office without knocking, a habit that would have earned him a reprimand from anyone else. Miller was a mountain of a man from rural Montana, with hands the size of dinner plates and a nose that had been broken in 3 different countries. He was the only person on base who knew why Elena spent her nights staring at traffic patterns on a grainy monitor. He dropped a lukewarm cardboard tray of coffee on her desk, the smell of burnt beans filling the cramped space. "The colonel's already talking about the clerical error in the NCO lounge," Miller said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look at her. He looked at the map on her wall. "He thinks he's being funny. Most of the guys are laughing because they want to stay on his good side. But I saw him watching you when you did the walkthrough of the East Gate yesterday. He doesn't like the way you look at things, Captain. He thinks you're looking for ghosts." I'm not looking for ghosts, Miller, Elena said, her voice flat and controlled. She took a sip of the coffee. It was terrible. She loved it. I'm looking for the structural integrity of the fence, physical and metaphorical. Did you get the numbers from the Oakhaven utility board? Miller nodded, leaning against the doorframe. Power usage in the 3 blocks surrounding the gate has been down 20% for the last 4 nights. People aren't staying home. They're congregating, and the local PD is being real quiet about where their tactical unit is staging. It's like they're waiting for us to make the first move so they can blame the feds. Thorne won't see it, Elena said. He wants a show of force. He's going to put the first platoon on the line with full riot gear. He thinks if he looks like a wall, they'll treat him like one, but walls are just targets. And what are you going to do? Miller asked. Elena leaned back in her chair, the springs groaning. I'm going to do my job. I'm going to monitor the gate, and I'm going to wait for the moment the wall starts to crack, because it will. And when it does, Thorne is going to realize that a riot isn't a battle. It's a conversation, and he doesn't know the language. The week leading up to the rally was an exercise in suppressed rage. Elena was excluded from the final tactical briefing in the vault, the high-security conference room where the real decisions were made. She found out about the deployment orders through a leaked memo on the shared drive. Thorne was moving the heavy assets to the north gate, the one that faced the highway, because that's where the optics were better. He was leaving the main gate, the one that bled directly into the heart of Oakhaven's most frustrated neighborhoods, to a skeleton crew and a few augmentation units from the administrative side of the house. It was a tactical blunder so profound it felt intentional. The kind of mistake made by a man who was more worried about how he looked on the evening news than the safety of the soldiers under his command. Elena spent those nights in her truck, parked in the shadows of a darkened motor pool, watching the main gate through a pair of high-end Steiner binoculars she'd bought with her own money. She watched the way the protesters began to gather in small, silent groups. They weren't chanting yet. They weren't holding signs. They were just standing, watching, measuring the response time of the guards. She saw a man in a red hooded sweatshirt walk the length of the fence 3 times, his hand trailing along the chain link, feeling for the tension. He wasn't a protester. He was an engineer. He was looking for the weak point. She tried to bring it to Thorne one last time on Friday morning. She intercepted him in the hallway of the HQ, her boots clicking sharply on the linoleum. He was flanked by his executive officer, a major who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of bureaucratic wood. "Colonel, a moment," Elena said. Thorne didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. "Captain Vance, I assume you're here to tell me about the atmospheric pressure or the migratory patterns of the local birds. I'm busy. We have a real mission to prep for." "The main gate is the primary point of failure, sir," she said, keeping pace with him, her voice a steady, rhythmic cadence. "The north gate is a distraction. The groups in Oakhaven are pooling resources near the residential sector. They aren't planning a march. They're planning a breach. If you don't reinforce the south perimeter, you're going to lose the gate before the sun goes down tomorrow." Thorne stopped then. He turned, his face reddening, his eyes narrowing until they were just slits of blue ice. He stepped into her personal space, the smell of his expensive aftershave clashing with the smell of the motor pool that still clung to her. "Listen to me, Captain. I put you in that office because I had to. I gave you those bars because the Army told me I had to, but do not mistake my compliance for respect. You have a talent for seeing things that aren't there. You're a theorist. I am a commander. I have 3 decades of experience that tells me people follow the cameras. The cameras are at the north gate. Now go back to your supply closet and stay out of the way of the people doing the actual work." He walked away, and for a second Elena felt the heat rise in her chest, a flicker of the Steubenville fire. Her hands clenched at her sides, the leather of her gloves creaking. She could have shouted. She could have cited regulations. She could have gone over his head to the base general, but she knew how that story ended. She had seen it a dozen times. The emotional woman who couldn't handle the pressure of command, so she did the only thing she knew how to do. She held it in. She controlled the rage until it was a cold, sharp tool she could use. She went back to her office and called Miller. "Pack the go bags in the truck," she said when he picked up. "Get the long-range comms and the non-lethal kit from the secondary locker, the stuff I signed for last month. The stuff Thorne told us to turn back in?" Miller's voice was cautious. "Exactly that stuff," Elena said. "And Miller, don't tell anyone where we're going. As far as the battalion is concerned, we're on administrative patrol of the housing area." "Copy that, Captain," Miller said, and she could hear the grin in his voice. "I'll meet you at the motor pool at 1600. Saturday morning arrived with a stillness that felt like a held breath. The temperature hit 90 degrees by 10 o'clock. By noon, it was 98. The air was thick with the smell of hot asphalt and the faint, sweet scent of the blooming oleanders that lined the base's boulevards. Elena sat in her truck, parked behind a row of decommissioned Humvees near the main gate. She had a laptop open on the passenger seat, hooked into a pirated feed from the base's security cameras. Miller was in the driver's seat, chewing on a piece of beef jerky, his eyes fixed on the gate. The main gate at Fort Valor was a bottleneck. 2 lanes of traffic going in, 2 going out, separated by a concrete guard shack. To the left and right, the fence stretched away into the scrub brush of the Texas plains. On the civilian side, a strip mall sat less than 50 yards from the entrance, its parking lot currently filling with cars that didn't belong to shoppers. "Look at the white van," Elena said, pointing to the screen. "Third row, it's been there for 3 hours. No one's gotten out. The suspension is sitting low." Miller squinted, loaded with gear or people. "And look at the roof of the laundromat," she continued. "See the glare. That's not glass, that's an optical lens. Someone is recording the guard rotations." Through her binoculars, she watched the 2 young MPs at the gate. They were barely 20, their uniforms crisp, their faces pale under their helmets. They were checking IDs with a mechanical boredom, unaware that they were being sized up like cattle in a slaughterhouse. They had M4s slung over their shoulders, but the magazines were tucked into their pouches and their holsters were thumb-locked. They were level 1 security, a presence, not a defense. At 1400, the first groups began to arrive. They didn't come in a march. They came in 1s and 2s, drifting across the street from the strip mall, standing on the sidewalk just outside the federal property line. They weren't carrying signs. They were carrying backpacks. Some of them wore masks despite the heat. The silence was the most unnerving part. Usually a protest is loud. It's a release of energy. This was an accumulation of it. "Here we go," Miller whispered. A man stepped out of the white van. He was wearing a red hooded sweatshirt. He didn't look at the guards. He looked at his watch. Then he raised his hand and made a sharp, cutting motion in the air. As if a switch had been flipped, the parking lot emptied. 100 people surged toward the gate, but they didn't go for the guards. They went for the fence line 50 yards to the left. They moved with a military precision that sent a chill down Elena's spine. These weren't angry locals. This was something else. They had bolt cutters, they had grappling hooks, and most importantly, they had the timing. "Call it in, Captain," Miller said, his hand reaching for the radio. "No," Elena said, her hand stopping his. "If we call it in now, Thorne will send a QRF to the north gate thinking it's a pincer move. He'll leave these kids at the gate to fend for themselves while he secures the perimeter. We wait." "Wait for what?" "For the moment they think they've won," she said. The breach happened in seconds. The fence was cut in 3 places simultaneously. The crowd didn't rush through in a chaotic mass. They moved in cells, 4 or 5 people at a time, fanning out as they hit the base soil. The 2 guards at the gate finally realized what was happening and leveled their weapons, shouting orders that were drowned out by the sudden, deafening roar of the crowd. "Drop the weapons, get back!" One of the guards screamed, his voice cracking. A brick caught him in the side of the helmet and he went down. The other guard hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger, his eyes wide with a terror that Elena knew all too well. It was the moment of the impossible choice. If he fired, he would start a massacre. If he didn't, he would be overrun. "Now," Elena said. She didn't use the radio. She grabbed the megaphone from the floor of the truck and stepped out into the searing heat. But she didn't run toward the gate. She ran toward the guard shack, her movements fluid and practiced, her body low to the ground. Miller was right behind her, carrying a long, heavy cylinder that looked like a piece of irrigation pipe. The crowd was 20 feet from the guard shack when Elena reached the fallen MP. She grabbed him by the tactical vest and hauled him behind the concrete barrier just as a Molotov cocktail shattered against the pavement where he'd been standing. The heat of the blast singed the hair on her arms, but she didn't flinch. She looked at the second guard, who was now backed into the corner of the shack, his M4 shaking in his hands. "Deep breaths, Corporal," she shouted over the din. "Don't fire, look at me, do not fire." The guard looked at her, his eyes unfocused. "Captain, they're coming inside." "I know," she said, her voice dropping into a calm, melodic register that cut through the noise like a blade. "And they're going to stop." Miller, the long-range acoustic device. Frequency 4, now. Miller set the cylinder on top of the concrete barrier and flipped a switch. A sound that wasn't a sound, a physical vibration that felt like it was trying to shake the teeth out of your skull, rippled across the pavement. The crowd at the front of the surge stumbled. Some of them dropped their backpacks and clutched their ears. It wasn't loud in the traditional sense. It was a pressurized wall of air that bypassed the eardrums and went straight for the inner ear. But it wouldn't hold them forever. The man in the red hoodie was already gesturing for his people to move around the sides, to use the guard shack as cover from the sound. Elena grabbed the megaphone. She didn't use the siren. She didn't use the move back command. She looked at the man in the red hoodie and spoke directly to him. "Mr. Callahan?" she shouted. Her voice was amplified, but it wasn't harsh. It was the voice of a teacher who had caught a student with a stolen test. "I know you're the one who bought the 4 dozen heavy-duty zip ties and the 3 gallons of accelerant at the Home Depot on 4th Street. I know you were a 12 Bravo in the 10th Mountain Division. I know you're angry about your brother. But if you take one more step, you're not a protester anymore. You're an enemy combatant on a federal installation, and you know exactly how that ends." The man froze. He looked at her, his hood falling back to reveal a face lined with grief and a hard, jagged scar along his jawline. The people around him slowed, their momentum breaking as they realized the woman in the captain's bars knew his name. They realized she wasn't looking at them as a mob. She was looking at them as individuals. "How do you know who I am?" The man shouted back, though his voice lacked its previous fire. "I know everyone who comes to my gate," Elena said. "I know why you're here, and I know that if you go through with this, your brother's name will be the last thing people remember before they start talking about the body count. Is that what he wanted? For you to die on a piece of scorched asphalt in front of a laundromat?" The air between them was thick with more than just heat. It was the weight of the sight. Elena saw the man's shoulders drop an inch. She saw the way his hand, which had been holding a heavy iron bar, loosened its grip. Behind her, she could hear the distant wail of sirens, Thorne's QRF finally realizing the North Gate was a ghost town. But they were minutes away. Minutes that would be the difference between a standoff and a bloodbath. "Captain," Miller hissed, "they're flanking to the right, the kids with the masks." Elena didn't look away from Callahan. "Tell them to stop, Marcus," she said, using his first name. "Tell them to stop now, or my sergeant is going to deploy the CS gas, and in this heat with this many people, someone's lungs are going to give out. You want a martyr? You'll get a dozen, but you won't get justice." Callahan looked at the people around him. He looked at the young MPs who were still trembling. He looked at the hole in the fence. Then he looked at Elena. For a long, silent moment, the world narrowed down to the two of them, the man who wanted to burn it all down and the woman who had spent her life learning how to put out the fire. "Back off." Callahan suddenly roared, his voice cracking. "Back off, we're done here, get back to the parking lot." The crowd hesitated, then began to recede, the energy draining out of them as quickly as it had arrived. They didn't run, they moved with the sluggish, exhausted gait of people who had been pushed to their limit and had nothing left to give. Elena didn't move, she didn't lower the megaphone. She watched until the last person had climbed back through the breach in the fence. She watched until the white van sped out of the parking lot. Only then did she turn to the fallen MP who was now sitting up, clutching his head. "You okay, son?" she asked, her voice returning to its flat, controlled tone. "Yes, ma'am," the boy whispered. "I think so, you knew his name." "Data, Corporal," Elena said, her eyes already scanning the horizon. "It's all just data." The dust had barely settled when the first of the heavy Humvees from the QRF screeched to a halt at the gate. Colonel Thorne was the first one out, his face a mask of fury, his hand on his sidearm. He looked at the cut fence, the smoldering pavement, and the group of protesters now standing silently across the street. Then he looked at Elena, who was standing in the middle of the road, her uniform stained with smoke and sweat, her new captain's bars glinting in the sun. "Captain Vance," Thorne barked, his voice shaking. "What the hell is going on here? Why are these people still on the perimeter? Why wasn't the gate secured?" Elena took a breath, the hot Texas air filling her lungs. She looked at Thorne, and for the first time in her career, she didn't see a commander. She saw a man who was out of his depth, a man who was terrified of the very thing he was supposed to lead. "The gate is secure, Colonel," she said, her voice steady and clear, loud enough for every soldier in the QRF to hear. "The situation has been de-escalated. There was a breach, and it was contained without a single shot being fired. I'll have my report on your desk by 0800. Thorne stepped toward her, his face inches from hers. "You disobeyed orders. You abandoned your assigned patrol area. You engaged with the enemy without authorization. I told you your promotion was a mistake, Vance, and by God, I'm going to make sure it's the last mistake this army makes with you." Elena didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She simply reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. She pressed play, asterisk. I am a commander. I have 3 decades of experience that tells me people follow the cameras. The cameras are at the north gate. Now go back to your supply closet and stay out of the way. Asterisk Thorne's face went from red to a pale, sickly gray. He looked at the recorder, then at the soldiers around him, who were all watching with an unnerving, silent intensity. That's a recording of a private briefing, Thorne hissed. It's a recording of a tactical failure, sir, Elena said. One that would have cost the lives of 2 of your soldiers and dozens of civilians if I hadn't been looking for ghosts. You can file the court-martial papers whenever you're ready. But before you do, you might want to look at the feed from the laundromat roof. I've already secured the footage. It shows exactly where you were when the breach happened, and where I was. She turned her back on him then. It was the ultimate act of defiance, a breach of protocol that should have ended her career on the spot. But she knew Thorne. She saw his pattern. He was a man who lived and died by his reputation, and she had just handed him a mirror. Miller, she said, walking toward her truck. Let's go. We have work to do. As she climbed into the passenger seat, her hands finally began to shake. It was a small tremor, a release of the pressure she'd been holding since the moment Thorne had pinned those bars on her. She looked at the dashboard, at the map of the base, and felt the cold, hard weight of what was coming next. This wasn't the end. The riot at the gate had been a test, a skirmish in a much larger war that was just beginning. She looked out the window as the truck pulled away. The man in the red hoodie was still there, standing on the edge of the strip mall parking lot. He didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge her. But as the truck passed, he nodded once, a sharp, grim movement that said he understood what had just happened. Elena Vance had saved the base. She had saved his life, and in doing so, she had painted a target on her back that would never go away. You think he'll actually do it? Miller asked, his eyes on the rearview mirror. The court-martial? No, Elena said, her voice sounding like the steel of Steubenville. He's going to do something much worse. He's going to pretend it was his plan all along, and then he's going to wait for me to make a real mistake. And will you? Elena looked at the silver bars on her collar, the light reflecting off them in a way that looked like a warning. I don't make mistakes, Miller. I only make decisions, and I've already made the next one. She reached into her bag and pulled out a second map, one that she hadn't shown anyone. It wasn't a map of Fort Valor. It was a map of the internal power structure of the Department of Defense, a web of names, dates, and connections that she had been tracing for years. At the center of the web was a name that made her heart go cold. Where are we going, Captain? Miller asked. Elena stared at the name on the map. We're going to find out why Marcus Thorne was so desperate to have a riot at the main gate today. Because he wasn't just incompetent, Miller. He was waiting for it. The truck moved through the base, the silence of the afternoon settling back over the scorched landscape, but the air still felt electric. The hum hadn't gone away. It had just changed frequency. And as Elena watched the gate disappear in the distance, she knew that the riot was just the opening act. The real fire was yet to come. She looked at her phone. A single message sat on the screen from an encrypted number she didn't recognize. Asterisk, the distraction worked. Proceed to phase 2. Asterisk, Elena didn't delete the message. She stared at it until the words burned into her mind. She had been right about the threat, but she had been wrong about the scale. The riot hadn't been the goal. It had been the cover, and she was the only one who knew. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just a captain in the MP battalion anymore. She was a witness. And in the world of men like Thorne, witnesses didn't get promotions. They got disappeared. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window and watched the Texas scrub brush blur by. She thought about her father, about the strike lines in Steubenville, and about the way the steel looked right before it broke. Drive faster, Miller, she said. Where to? The airfield, she said, her voice a whisper. We need to get to the black box before they wipe the server. If I'm right about this, the riot wasn't the only thing that happened at 1400. As the truck accelerated, the first heavy drops of a summer thunderstorm began to pelt the windshield, blurring the world into a gray, uncertain haze. The storm had finally arrived, and Elena Vance was driving straight into the eye of it. The rain hitting the windshield of the Chevy Silverado sounded like small arms fire against a tin roof. A rhythmic, violent tapping that Elena Vance counted in sets of 4. It was 1642 hours. The sky over San Antonio had turned the color of a bruised lung, and the smell of ozone was so thick it tasted like copper on the back of her tongue. She didn't look at the encrypted message on her phone again. She didn't have to. The words were etched into the part of her brain that processed ballistic trajectories and logistical manifests. Asterisk, the distraction worked. Proceed to phase 2. Asterisk, it wasn't the who that chilled her. It was the when. The message had been time-stamped at 14:03, exactly 3 minutes after the breach at the main gate began. While she had been standing on the asphalt, using the sight to talk Marcus Callahan down from a felony, the real play had already been made. "Hangar 4 is restricted after 1600 for the weekend, Captain," Miller said, his voice low, matching the hum of the tires against the flooded perimeter road. He didn't ask why they were going there. He didn't ask about the message. He just drove, his large hands relaxed on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the tree line for anything that didn't belong. He was a man who understood that in Elena's world, the why was always buried under layers of how, and they didn't have time for the excavation yet. The server for the automated flight following system is housed in the comms closet behind the weather desk, Elena said, her voice flat, devoid of the adrenaline that should have been there. She was already visualizing the layout of the airfield. "It's on a separate loop from the main HQ network. Thorne can freeze my access to the battalion share drive, but he can't touch the FAA-linked logs without a signature from the base commander. If something landed or took off during the riot, the AFF will have a transponder ghost." "And if it was a dark flight?" Miller asked. "Nothing is completely dark in Texas airspace," she replied. "Too many civilian Cessnas and commercial liners. You go dark, you risk a mid-air. They would have used a squawk code, a discrete transponder signal, something that looks like a routine training flight to a casual observer but tells the tower to look the other way." They passed the row of sun-bleached barracks, the windows dark, the soldiers inside likely still buzzing from the afternoon's chaos. Elena watched the way the puddles rippled as they drove past. She thought about Steubenville. She thought about the time the furnace at the mill had blown a seal, and her father had stayed inside the heat zone for 20 minutes to manually crank a bypass valve. When he came out, the skin on his forearms was the color of a sunset, peeling in long, translucent strips. He hadn't cried. He hadn't even cursed. He just looked at Elena, then 7 years old, and said, asterisk, the trick isn't ignoring the heat, El. The trick is knowing that the metal doesn't care if you're burning. It only cares if you finish the turn. Asterisk, the airfield at Fort Valor was a vast, flat expanse of concrete and misery, currently being hammered by the tropical depression rolling in from the Gulf. Hangar 4 sat on the far eastern edge, away from the shiny transport planes and the VIP Gulf Streams. It was the working hangar, where the airframes went to be stripped, greased, and forgotten. As Miller pulled the truck into the shadow of the massive corrugated steel structure, the rain intensified, turning the world into a gray blur. Elena stepped out of the truck, the water instantly soaking through her ACUs, the fabric clinging to her skin with a cold, heavy weight. She didn't run. Running attracted the eye. She walked with the purposeful gait of an officer who was exactly where she was supposed to be. The airfield was quiet, the only sound the distant roar of the wind and the metallic groan of the hangar doors shifting in their tracks. Inside the flight ops office, the air was stagnant, smelling of stale popcorn and the specific, dry scent of electronics that had been running too long. A single NCO sat behind a plexiglass barrier, a specialist with a name tape that read Holloway. He was leaning back in a swivel chair, his boots up on the desk, scrolling through a phone. He didn't look up until Elena's shadow fell across his station. "We're closed, ma'am," Holloway said without dropping his feet. "Airfield's on a weather hold. Nothing's moving until the ceiling lifts above 500 feet. Elena didn't say a word. She stood there, letting the water drip from the brim of her patrol cap onto the linoleum, her eyes fixed on the specialist. She didn't look angry. She looked inevitable. It was a look she had perfected during her first tour in Mosul, one that made people realize that the shortest path to getting her to leave was to give her exactly what she wanted. Holloway slowly lowered his feet. He cleared his throat, his posture straightening as he finally processed the captain's bars and the salt-crusted intensity of her gaze. "Can I help you, Captain? I need the AFF logs for the 1400 to 1500 window," Elena said. Holloway blinked. "Those are automated, ma'am. They get batched and sent to the S3 at the end of the shift. I don't have the authorization to pull them mid-cycle. You have a grade 4 maintenance override for the server closet specialist," Elena said. "It's required for your MOS. I'm not asking for the batched report. I'm asking to see the raw data on the terminal." There's a discrepancy in the ground sensor logs at the south gate, and I need to cross-reference the arrival times of the QRF air support that was placed on standby. Holloway hesitated. He was looking for a reason to say no, his mind shuffling through the deck of Army regulations, but Elena was already moving. She walked around the side of the desk, her boots squeaking on the floor. She didn't wait for permission. She moved with the dark competence that Miller often joked was her most terrifying trait, the ability to act as if the world's rules were merely suggestions that didn't apply to the current 10 square feet she occupied. "Ma'am, I really should call the chief," Holloway said, rising from his chair, his hand hovering over the desk phone. Elena stopped and turned. She was 6 inches shorter than him, but she felt like she occupied the entire room. "If you call Chief Miller, you're going to have to explain why you didn't notice the transponder bleed on the secondary radar loop at 1412. You were on duty, weren't you? Watching the screen." Holloway's face went pale. He hadn't been watching the screen. He'd been watching a highlight reel of the Cowboys game. He knew it, and he knew that Elena knew it. The sight wasn't just about reading the enemy, it was about reading the laziness of the bureaucracy. 5 minutes, Holloway whispered, his hand dropping away from the phone. "The closet is around the corner. If anyone asks, I was in the latrine." "I was never here, specialist," Elena said. The comms closet was a 4x4 room packed with humming server racks and a tangle of fiber-optic cables that looked like the nervous system of a prehistoric beast. The heat in the room was intense, a dry, artificial warmth that made the dampness of her uniform start to steam. Elena sat at the small maintenance terminal, her fingers moving across the keyboard with a precision that was purely mechanical. She didn't think about Thorne. She didn't think about the message. She thought about the data. She pulled up the AFF loop. The screen was a chaotic dance of green and white symbols representing every aircraft in a 100-mile radius. She narrowed the filter to Fort Valor's local airspace. 1400, 1405, 1410. At 1412, a symbol appeared on the edge of the screen. It wasn't a standard military icon. It was a Type S transponder code, a non-standard civilian pattern signal often used by government agencies or private contractors. It hadn't come from the main runway. It had originated from the assault strip, a cracked 2,000-foot stretch of asphalt on the far northern edge of the base, used primarily for parachute drops and engine-out drills. The aircraft was a Pilatus PC-12, a rugged, single-engine turboprop, the Swiss Army knife of clandestine aviation. Elena watched the playback. The Pilatus hadn't stayed on the ground long. It had landed at 1408, right as the breach at the main gate was reaching its peak. It had taxied to the edge of Hangar 12, the no-go zone, a facility officially listed as a joint service forensics lab, but which everyone on base knew was something else entirely. It stayed for exactly 4 minutes. It didn't refuel. It didn't take on cargo. At 1412, it took off again, climbing steeply to avoid the standard flight paths, heading west-southwest toward the border. "What did you find?" Miller's voice came from the doorway, low and steady. He was leaning against the frame, his frame blocking the light from the hallway. "A ghost," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "PC-12. Landed at Hangar 12 during the height of the riot. 4 minutes on the deck, no manifest, no tail number in the local logs. It squawked a civilian code that doesn't exist in the FAA database." "A snatch and grab?" Miller asked. "Or a delivery?" Elena replied. Thorne didn't just ignore the main gate because he's an idiot, Miller. He ignored it because he needed the QRF, the MPs, and the cameras focused on the south perimeter. He needed the noise of the riot to cover the silence of that plane. He wasn't the commander of the response. He was the conductor of the distraction. She felt a cold, sharp prickle at the base of her neck. It was the feeling she got right before an IED went off, the sudden, violent realization that the world had shifted under her feet and she was the only one who had felt it. She reached out and touched the screen, her finger tracing the path of the Pilatus. "Phase 2, she whispered. "The riot was Phase 1, the plane was Phase 2. "Then what's Phase 3? Miller asked. Elena didn't answer. She pulled her CAC card from the reader and stood up. As she did, the terminal screen flickered. A window popped up in the center of the monitor, a red box with white text that sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Asterisk access denied. Credentials suspended. Contact Command Security Officer. Asterisk, we need to move, Elena said, her voice tightening. Now. They exited the flight ops office just as a pair of white MP subs pulled into the parking lot, their light bars dark but their intent clear. They weren't there for a routine patrol. They were moving with a tactical spacing that Elena recognized instantly. They were boxing the exit. "Through the hangar," Elena hissed, grabbing Miller's arm. They ducked into the cavernous interior of Hangar 4, the air smelling of hydraulic fluid and old rubber. The space was a forest of steel scaffolding and partially disassembled Huey helicopters. They moved through the shadows, the sound of their boots muffled by the ambient roar of the rain on the roof. "The truck is a lost cause," Miller said, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "They'll have the plates flagged at every gate by now. If we try to drive out, we're done." "We're not leaving the base," Elena said. "Not yet. If I leave now, Thorne wins the narrative. He'll say I went AWOL after the riot. He'll paint me as the unstable officer who cracked under pressure. I need to know what was on that plane, Miller, and I need to know why Hangar 12 is the destination." They reached the far end of the hangar, a small side door that led out toward the fuel pits. Elena paused, her hand on the latch. She looked at Miller. He was wet, tired, and currently aiding and abetting a captain whose credentials had just been burned by the very institution they both served. He had a wife in Billings and a daughter who was starting kindergarten in the fall. He had every reason to walk away, to say he was just following her orders and didn't know the score. "Miller," she said, her voice softer than it had been all day. "You don't have to do this. You can head back to the barracks. Tell them I went around the bend. Tell them I forced you to drive me." Miller didn't even blink. He adjusted the strap of his go bag, his face a mask of calm Montana granite. "Captain, I've been following you since the day you pulled me out of that ditch in Hellmand. You didn't ask for my manifest then, and I'm not asking for yours now. Besides, if I go back now, I'll just have to listen to Thorne talk about his optics for another 4 hours. I'd rather be in the rain with you." Elena felt a lump in her throat, a rare, sharp pang of emotion that she quickly suppressed. She nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than any medal ceremony. "The fuel pits have a maintenance tunnel that runs under the taxiway. It comes up near the motor pool. From there we can get to the old housing area. Nobody goes there anymore. It's a ghost town." "Lead the way, boss," Miller said. The tunnel was a concrete coffin, 4 feet high and smelling of damp earth and rot. They crawled through the darkness, the only light coming from the small LED on Elena's watch. The silence was absolute, a crushing weight that made every breath sound like a shout. Elena felt the specific, physical tension of the impossible choice again. She was crossing a line. Once they reached the end of this tunnel, there was no going back. She was no longer a captain in the United States Army. She was a variable that the system was trying to solve. They emerged an hour later in the basement of a condemned duplex on the edge of the old housing area. The neighborhood was a relic of the 1970s, a grid of identical houses with peeling paint and boarded-up windows, overgrown with Texas scrub and thorns. It was a place where the base tucked away its secrets, broken equipment, outdated files, and the occasional soldier who needed to disappear for a few days of administrative leave. Elena sat on the floor of the darkened living room, her back against the wall, watching the rain through a crack in the plywood over the window. Miller was in the kitchen, checking their supplies. They had 2 pistols, 4 spare magazines, a tablet with a local cache of base maps, and 3 liters of water. It wasn't much, but Elena had survived on less in places that were much more hostile than San Antonio. "The Wi-Fi is still active in the housing office across the street," Miller said, appearing in the doorway. "It's a low-security node. I can probably piggyback off it if I can get close enough. We might be able to get back into the Nipper net through a back door." "Don't," Elena said. "They'll be looking for a digital signature. We stay dark. We need to think like Callahan." "The guy from the gate. He wasn't there for the protest, Miller. He was there for the mission. He's a 12 Bravo, a combat engineer. He knows how to breach, how to clear, and how to hold. And he's angry. People like that don't get recruited by accident. They get pointed." She closed her eyes, the sight taking over. She replayed the riot in her mind, not as a chaotic event, but as a series of data points. The white van, the optical lens on the roof, the man in the red hoodie, the timing of the breach, the landing of the PC-12. "It's a shell game," she whispered. "Thorne isn't the one running it. He's just a piece. He's the one who provides the cover. The real player is whoever sent that message to my phone. Someone who knows my number. Someone who knew exactly where I would be." She opened her eyes and looked at Miller. What if the riot wasn't just a distraction for the plane? What if the plane was a distraction for something else? Something happening right now while the whole base is on lockdown and the MPs are hunting us. Before Miller could answer, a low, rhythmic thudding began to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of heavy rotors, a lot of them. Elena moved to the window, peering through the crack. Over the tree line, she saw the dark shapes of 4 black hawks flying low and fast, their lights blacked out. They weren't heading for the airfield. They were heading for the center of the base, toward the vault, the high-security command center where the base general and the senior staff were currently holed up, managing the post-riot crisis. "Those aren't our birds," Miller said, his voice tight. "The 402nd doesn't have a flight of Black Hawks on standby." "No," Elena said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Those are special activities, and they're not landing. They are hovering." Through her binoculars, she saw the fast ropes drop from the open doors of the lead helicopter. Figures in dark tactical gear, devoid of any patches or markings, began to descend onto the roof of the vault. It was a precision hit, executed with a lethal efficiency that made the afternoon's riot look like a playground scrap. "It's a coup," Miller whispered, his voice filled with a disbelief that Elena didn't share. "No," Elena said, her mind racing. "It's an extraction. They're not taking the base. They're taking someone out of it, or they're taking something that was moved into the vault during the chaos." She thought about the PC-12, the 4 minutes on the deck at Hangar 12, the no-go zone. "The plane brought the team," she said, the pieces finally clicking into place with a sickening thud. The PC-12 landed the operators at Hangar 12. They moved through the utility tunnels, the same ones we just used, to get into position under the vault. The riot kept the security forces occupied. Now the birds are here to pick them up, along with whatever they came for. She looked at her watch, 1812. Thorne isn't in on the whole thing, she realized. He thinks he's just helping a black project move some sensitive cargo. He thinks he's being a good soldier, playing his part in a classified op. He doesn't realize he's the fall guy for an armed robbery on a federal installation. "We have to call it in," Miller said. "The general's in there. The comms are likely jammed, and even if they aren't, who's going to believe us?" Elena asked. "We're the 2 most wanted people on base right now. If we call it in, they'll say we're the ones conducting the hit. They'll say the riot was our cover." She looked back at the helicopters. The first group of figures was already ascending the ropes, carrying a heavy metallic case between them. They moved with a synchronized grace that spoke of thousands of hours of training. These weren't mercenaries. These were the best of the best, operating in the shadows of their own flag. "We can't stop the extraction," Elena said, her voice dropping into that cold, melodic register again. "But we can see where they go, and we can make sure the trail doesn't end here." "How?" "The PC-12, Elena said. "It's still in the air. I saw the flight path. It's heading for a private airstrip near Uvalde, but the helicopters, they don't have the range to get that far without refueling, not with a full load and the wind. They're going to hit a FARP, a forward arming and refueling point, and I know exactly which one they'll use." She turned to Miller, her eyes burning with a dark, focused fire. "The old bombing range at the west end of the base. It's got a fuel bladder that hasn't been emptied in years. It's isolated, it's off the main sensors, and it's exactly where I would go if I wanted to disappear into the scrub." "It's 6 miles from here," Miller said. "On foot, through the brush, in this rain?" "We're not going on foot," Elena said. She pointed out the window to a rusted olive-drab Jeep Willys sitting under a rotted carport 2 houses down. It was a museum piece, probably owned by a retired sergeant major who had lived there 20 years ago and forgotten to take it with him. It was old, it was loud, and it had no electronic signature. "You think it runs?" Miller asked. "It's a Jeep, Miller. It'll run if you spit on the spark plugs and tell it a lie." They moved through the rain, staying low, the shadows of the old houses providing a meager cover. The air was thick with the sound of the Black Hawks moving away, the low-frequency thrum of their engines fading into the distance. The base was in a state of total paralysis. The sirens were still wailing at the main gate, and the searchlights were sweeping the north perimeter, but the heart of Fort Valor had just been cut out, and nobody had even noticed the blood. The Jeep was a wreck. The tires were cracked, the seats were home to a family of field mice, and the steering wheel was slick with mold. But when Miller popped the hood, he found a clean engine block and a battery that, miraculously, still held a flicker of life. "Direct jump," Miller muttered, using a pair of pliers to bridge the solenoid. The engine groaned, a slow, tortured sound that seemed to echo through the empty neighborhood. Elena held her breath, her hand on the cold metal of the door. "Asterisk, come on, you old bastard. Just this once." Asterisk with a violent shudder and a cloud of blue smoke that smelled like 1974, the engine caught. It was loud, deafeningly loud in the quiet of the housing area, but it was alive. "Go," Elena said, vaulting into the passenger seat. They drove without lights, Miller navigating by the flashes of lightning and a preternatural sense of direction. The Jeep bounced and bucked over the unpaved trails, the suspension screaming with every hit. Elena sat with her pistol in her lap, her eyes fixed on the western horizon. She felt a strange, jarring sense of clarity. The bureaucracy was gone. The rank was gone. The silver bars on her collar were just pieces of metal again. There was only the mission, the partner at her side, and the cold, hard truth of the sight. They reached the edge of the bombing range 30 minutes later. The area was a wasteland of twisted metal targets and cratered earth, a place where the army spent its days practicing the art of destruction. In the center of the range sat a small concrete pad and a cluster of fuel bladders hidden under camouflaged netting. And there they were. The 4 Black Hawks were landed in a tight diamond formation, their rotors still spinning in a low-idle, flat pitch. The figures in tactical gear were moving quickly, dragging fuel hoses to the aircraft. The metallic case she had seen on the roof was being loaded into the lead helicopter. "What's in the box, Captain?" Miller whispered, the Jeep idling in the shadow of a collapsed observation tower 500 yards away. "I don't know," Elena said, "but they killed the base's internal comms and risked a mid-air collision to get it. It's not just classified, it's world-ending classified." She pulled out her binoculars. Through the rain, she saw a figure step out of the lead helicopter. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing a flight suit, but he wasn't a pilot. He stood with a familiar, arrogant posture, his hands on his hips as he watched the refueling. "Is that—" Miller started. "Colonel Thorne," Elena finished, her voice a cold rasp. He wasn't the fall guy, he was the passenger. He was leaving. He had traded his career, his battalion, and his honor for a seat on that bird. Elena watched him through the glass, her finger itching for a trigger she couldn't pull. "Not yet. He's not leaving because he has to," she said. "He's leaving because he's done. Whatever was in that vault was his ticket out. He's been working this for months, Miller. The clerical error that got me promoted, the transfer to the supply closet. It wasn't because he hated me. It was because he knew I'd see it. He wanted me sidelined so I'd be a non-factor when the day came. But he underestimated the one thing he could never understand." "What's that?" "Steubenville," Elena said. She looked at the fuel bladders. She looked at the helicopters. She looked at the man who had tried to bury her in a supply closet. The sight was screaming at her now, a high-frequency vibration that told her the melting point had been reached. The structural integrity of the conspiracy was failing, and all it needed was a catalyst. "Miller," she said, "the fuel hoses, they are high pressure, right?" "Yeah, dead man switches at the nozzle. Why?" "If the pressure spikes at the source, the safety valves are supposed to trip," she said. "But those bladders are 20 years old. The maintenance logs I saw in the supply closet last week showed that the relief valves on the Range 4 fuel farm were flagged for replacement in 2019. They never were." Miller looked at her, a slow, grim realization dawning on his face. "If you hit the pump assembly with enough force, the pressure won't trip the valve. It'll blow the seal at the nozzle." "Inside the engine intake of a running Black Hawk," Elena said. "That's a suicide mission, Captain. We'd have to get within 50 yards of the perimeter guards to get a clear shot at the pump." "We're not shooting the pump, Miller," Elena said, her voice dropping into a whisper. "We're going to drive into it." She looked at him, the rain streaming down her face, her eyes searching his. She was asking for everything now, not just his loyalty, but his life. The cost she had been dreading since the morning arrived, and it was heavier than she had imagined. Miller looked at the helicopters, then back at her. He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and steady. "I always hated this Jeep anyway," he said. They moved. Miller floored the accelerator, and the Jeep roared out of the shadows, its engine screaming in a final, defiant mechanical prayer. They didn't have lights, but they didn't need them. The lightning provided the path. The guards at the perimeter of the refueling point were caught completely off guard. They were looking for a tactical team, for a QRF, for a threat that spoke their language. They weren't looking for a rusted 1970s relic driven by 2 ghosts. "Hold on," Miller shouted. The first volley of fire hit the windshield, the glass shattering into 1,000 diamonds. Elena ducked, her hand grabbing the roll bar as the Jeep swerved through the mud. They were 100 yards out. 80, 60. She saw Thorne turn, his face a mask of sudden, panicked recognition. He shouted something, gesturing wildly toward the approaching Jeep, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the rotors and the scream of the engine. "Now!" Elena yelled. Miller steered the Jeep straight for the central pump assembly, a squat, metal box sitting between the 2 primary fuel bladders. At the last second, he slammed on the brakes and spun the wheel, sending the Jeep into a violent, sliding broadside. Elena didn't wait for the impact. She rolled out of the passenger side, her body hitting the mud and tumbling into a shallow drainage ditch. A second later, the Jeep slammed into the pump with the force of a wrecking ball. The explosion wasn't a fireball, not yet. It was a geyser of JP-8 fuel, pressurized to 300 pounds per square inch, erupting into the air like a black fountain. The failed relief valves did exactly what Elena had predicted. The pressure surged through the hoses, and the nozzles inside the Black Hawk's engine nacelles shattered. The lead helicopter's right engine ingested the raw fuel and coughed, a violent metallic sound that was followed by a bloom of orange flame. The pilot tried to compensate, but the fuel was everywhere, coating the fuselage, the rotors, the ground. "Get back!" Someone screamed. Elena scrambled out of the ditch, her pistol drawn. She wasn't looking for the guards. She was looking for Thorn. She saw him trying to scramble back into the flaming helicopter, his hands clutching the metallic case. He was desperate, his mask of command completely gone, replaced by the primal terror of a man who realized the fire had finally caught up to him. "Colonel?" Elena's voice cut through the chaos, a sharp, clear command that seemed to stop the world for a heartbeat. Thorn froze. He looked across the flaming landscape and saw her. A mud-stained, rain-soaked captain standing in the middle of the wreckage, her weapon leveled at his chest. "The metal doesn't care if you're burning, Marcus," she said, her voice a cold, melodic echo of her father's. "It only cares if you finish the turn." The lead helicopter groaned as its landing gear buckled, the weight of the fire and the failing engine finally too much. The rotors clipped the ground with a sound like 1,000 chainsaws hitting a stone wall, sending shards of carbon fiber screaming through the air. Thorn dropped the case. He turned to run, but the blast wave from the main fuel bladder caught him, throwing him like a rag doll into the darkness of the scrub brush. Elena didn't move. She watched the fire. She watched the remaining 3 Black Hawks lift off in a panicked, ragged formation, abandoning their cargo and their co-conspirator. They disappeared into the storm, their lights flickering like dying stars. Silence returned to the bombing range, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the hiss of the rain on the hot metal. Elena stood there for a long time, her chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly receding to leave a hollow, aching cold. "Captain?" She turned. Miller was standing 10 feet away, his face covered in soot and blood, but his eyes were clear. He was holding the metallic case. It was heavy, scorched by the fire, but intact. "We got it," he said, his voice a low rumble. Elena looked at the case. She looked at the burning wreckage of the Jeep. She looked at the distant lights of Fort Valor, where the sirens were finally starting to fade. She had saved the secret. She had stopped the extraction. But as she looked at the silver bars on her collar, she knew the cost was just beginning to be tallied. She wasn't a captain anymore. She wasn't even a soldier. She was something else. "What now?" Miller asked. Elena reached out and touched the cold metal of the case. She felt a vibration coming from inside it, a low-frequency hum that she recognized. It wasn't data. It wasn't a weapon. It was a heartbeat. The realization hit her like a physical blow, a gap opening in the world that she knew she would never be able to close. She looked at Miller, her eyes wide with a terror she hadn't felt all day. "Miller," she whispered, "it's not a thing, it's a person." She reached for the latches of the case, her hands shaking for the first time in her life. She had been right about the threat, right about the pattern, and right about the betrayal. But she had been fundamentally, devastatingly wrong about what they were fighting for. As the first latch clicked open, a red light began to pulse from the seam of the case, illuminating the rain-streaked mud in a rhythmic, bloody glow. From the direction of the base, a new sound began to rise, a low, mournful wail that wasn't a siren. It was the sound of 1,000 voices, a collective realization that something had changed in the air of Fort Valor. Elena Vance took a breath, the smell of smoke and ozone filling her lungs, and she pulled the lid back. The story wasn't over. It had just reached the breaking point. The first latch gave way with a sound like a bone snapping in a quiet room, a sharp, mechanical protest that was immediately swallowed by the roar of the burning JP-8 fuel behind them. Elena Vance didn't hesitate. She didn't look back at the inferno or the broken Jeep or the body of Marcus Thorn somewhere in the dark Texas scrub. Her world had narrowed to the 3 inches of space between the lid of the case and its base. She popped the second latch, and the pressurized seal hissed, a long, exhaling sigh of recycled, sterile air that smelled of ozone and hospital-grade disinfectant. a jarring contrast to the thick, sulphurous stench of the bombing range. When the lid swung back, the red pulsing light from within hit Elena's face, casting long, rhythmic shadows across her high cheekbones. She didn't gasp. She didn't recoil. She simply stopped breathing for a beat of 3. Inside the padded, carbon fiber interior, nestled amidst a web of translucent cooling tubes and glowing biometric sensors, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her hair was a shock of white blonde, plastered to her forehead by a fine sheen of sweat. She was wearing a simple, pale gray clinical tunic, and her small arms were laced with the thin blue lines of intravenous leads. A compact respirator mask covered her nose and mouth, its valve clicking with a rhythmic, artificial precision that matched the pulsing red light. "Miller," Elena said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. Miller was there a second later, his boots squelching in the red mud, his primary weapon leveled at the darkness beyond the firelight. He looked down into the case, and for the first time in the 5 years Elena had known him, she saw his hands tremble. The movement was slight, a mere fraction of a millimeter, but in the world of the sight it was a tectonic shift. "Is that a kid?" Miller's voice was a ghost of itself, stripped of its Montana gravel. "Tell me that's not a kid, Captain." "It's not just a kid," Elena said, her eyes scanning the biometric readout on the inside of the lid. The numbers were scrolling in a proprietary encryption she didn't recognize, but the heart rate was clear, 112 beats per minute. High, stressed, even under sedation. "She's the payload, the classified forensics at Hangar 12. The reason Thorne burned his life down." Elena reached down, her gloved fingers hovering over the girl's pulse point. She didn't touch her. Not yet. She could feel the heat radiating from the child, not the heat of a fever, but a strange, humming energy that made the fine hairs on Elena's forearms stand up. It was the same feeling she got from the server racks in flight ops, a static charge that tasted like copper. "We have to move," Miller hissed, his head snapping toward the northern tree line. "The birds are gone, but they'll have a QRF on the way, not the MPs, the people who own those Black Hawks. They aren't going to let us walk away with their property." "She isn't property," Elena said. She reached into the case and began disconnecting the external power leads, her movements fluid and practiced. She had spent 2 years in a combat medical unit before OCS. She knew how to move a patient under fire. But this wasn't a patient. This was a variable she hadn't calculated. The sight had shown her the betrayal, the plane, the distraction, but it had hidden the face of the girl. It was a blind spot in the probability matrix, and that meant the stakes were higher than the theft of a weapon or a code. "The life support is on an internal battery," Elena muttered, more to herself than to Miller. "We have 90 minutes, maybe less in this humidity." She lifted the girl. The child was impossibly light, as if her bones were made of something less dense than calcium. Elena tucked her against her chest, the girl's head resting in the crook of her neck. The respirator mask hissed against Elena's collarbone. "The case?" Miller asked. "Leave it. We can't carry 60 pounds of carbon fiber and stay mobile. Grab the medical kit from the side pocket and the tablet. Everything else stays." They turned away from the fire and ran. The bombing range was a 6-mile expanse of cratered earth and unexploded ordnance, a landscape designed to kill. In the daylight, it was a navigational nightmare. At night, in a tropical depression, it was a tomb. Elena led the way, her boots finding the high ground by instinct, her mind already unfolding the map of the terrain. She felt the sight begin to bloom at the edges of her vision. It wasn't a visual hallucination. It was a sudden, violent clarity. The darkness wasn't dark anymore. It was a series of gradients, of thermal signatures and structural weaknesses. She saw the way the rain-softened mud would give way under a certain weight. She saw the metallic signature of a buried M107 projectile 10 feet to their left, dormant but dangerous. She saw the path of least resistance through the mesquite brush, a jagged line of probability that she followed without a word. "Contact, 3 o'clock." Miller's voice was a sharp bark. Elena dropped to one knee, shielding the girl with her own body. She didn't look for the threat with her eyes, she looked for it with the sight. She felt the ripple in the air, the displacement of space that came from a high-velocity projectile. Asterisk crack. Asterisk the round hit a twisted piece of a target drone 5 feet behind them, the sparks brief and angry in the rain. "Sniper," Miller whispered, already prone in the mud. "Thermal optics. He's got the high ground on the observation tower." "He doesn't have a lock," Elena said, her heart rate remaining a steady, cold 60 beats per minute. "The fire from the jeep is messing with his thermal signature. He's shooting at shadows." "He'll find us," Miller said. "No, he won't." Elena closed her eyes. The world turned into a wireframe. She calculated the distance to the tower, 450 meters. The wind was gusting from the west at 15 knots. The humidity was 98%. She felt the girl's heart beating against her own, a frantic hummingbird rhythm. "Give me your rifle," Elena said. "Captain, you're holding the kid. Give me the rifle." Miller slid his M4 across the mud. Elena didn't let go of the girl. She shifted her weight, propping the child against her left shoulder, using her left hand to support the small body and her right to take the grip of the rifle. She didn't use the bipod. She didn't use the optic. She rested the handguard on a rusted piece of rebar sticking out of the ground. She didn't breathe. She didn't wait for the lightning. She waited for the moment when the wind died, a 3-second window of atmospheric stability that only she could feel. Asterisk thud. Asterisk the suppressed shot was a dull punch in the air. 450 meters away, a silhouette tumbled from the top of the observation tower, a dark shape falling into a darker void. There was no scream, just the sound of the wind. "Jesus, Elena," Miller breathed. "Move," she said, handing the rifle back. "They're not shooting at shadows anymore." They ran harder now, the adrenaline finally beginning to burn through the cold. The rain was relentless, a physical weight that tried to pull them into the earth. Elena's shoulder was screaming. The impact of the Jeep had done more damage than she'd admitted to Miller, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't. Every time she looked down at the girl, she saw something new. The girl's skin was beginning to glow. Not a bright light, but a faint bioluminescent shimmer, a soft violet hue that pulsed in time with the respirator. It was beautiful and terrifying, a signal fire for anyone with the right sensors. "They're using drones," Miller said, pointing upward. Through a gap in the clouds, Elena saw the red and green navigation lights of a predator. It was circling high, but its synthetic aperture radar would be burning through the rain, looking for 2 human-sized heat signatures and 1 pulsing violet anomaly. "The culvert," Elena said, pointing toward a concrete drainage pipe that ran under the main perimeter road. "If we can get inside, the concrete will mask the thermal." "It's flooded, boss. Better to be wet than dead, Miller." They slid down the embankment, the mud coating them in a slick, freezing layer of silt. The culvert was 3 feet in diameter, half filled with rushing, brown water that smelled of oil and old earth. Elena went in first, clutching the girl to her chest, her back scraping against the rough concrete. The water was up to her waist, the current trying to sweep her legs out from under her. "I've got the rear," Miller said, his voice echoing in the tunnel. They crawled for what felt like miles, though it couldn't have been more than a few hundred yards. The silence inside the pipe was deafening, the only sound the rushing water and the girl's respirator. Elena felt the cold sinking into her bones, the kind of cold that starts in the marrow and works its way out. Her hands were numb, her grip on the child maintained by sheer force of will. She stopped when she felt the vibration. It wasn't a sound. It was a rhythmic thudding through the concrete, the heavy, deliberate footfalls of something large. "Miller, stop," she whispered. She pressed her ear to the side of the pipe. The sight flared. Above them on the road, a convoy was passing, not the white subs of the MPs. These were heavy vehicles, strikers. The 402 ND's armored assets. Thorne hadn't just used his own men. He had mobilized the battalion under the guise of a base-wide security threat. He was using the very institution Elena served to hunt her down. "They're blocking the exits," Miller said, his voice tight. "If they have strikers on the perimeter road, they've got the whole range boxed in. There's nowhere to go, Elena." Elena looked at the girl. The violet glow was brighter now, reflecting off the surface of the muddy water. The child's eyes were open. They weren't human eyes. They were wide, pupilless orbs of shimmering silver swirling like mercury in a storm. She wasn't looking at Elena. She was looking asterisk through asterisk her, staring at something in the distance that Elena couldn't see. "She's awake," Elena whispered. The girl didn't speak. She didn't cry. She reached up with a small, trembling hand and touched Elena's cheek. The contact was like an electric shock, a surge of data and emotion that nearly knocked Elena backward into the water. She saw flashes of things she didn't understand. A laboratory in the desert, a forest of glass tubes, the face of a woman who looked like her but wasn't, and a name that echoed in the back of her mind like a bell. Asterisk area. Asterisk, her name is Area, Elena said, her voice trembling. "How do you know that?" Miller asked. "She told me." The vibration on the road above stopped. A hatch opened. A voice, amplified by a bullhorn, tore through the night. Captain Vance, this is Colonel Thorne. I know you can hear me. You have in your possession a highly sensitive medical asset that requires immediate stabilization. Every minute you keep her in that environment, you are endangering her life. Surrender now, and I will ensure that Sergeant Major Miller is granted full immunity. You have 5 minutes to emerge with your hands up. Miller looked at Elena. The light from his tactical watch showed the exhaustion etched into his face, the realization that they were out of options, out of luck, and nearly out of time. Immunity, Miller spat. He's a liar, Elena. He'll kill us both the second we step out of this pipe. I know, Elena said. She looked at the girl, Aria. The silver eyes were fixed on her now, and Elena felt a strange, calm certainty wash over her. It wasn't the sight, it was something deeper. A realization that the mission hadn't failed. The mission had changed. She wasn't an officer of the United States Army anymore. She was a protector. Miller, she said, her voice regaining its iron core. Remember the old housing area, the one we just left? Yeah. There's a utility map in the case tablet. There's a secondary drainage line that intersects with this one 300 meters ahead. It leads to the basement of the old base chapel. It was decommissioned in '92, but the tunnels were never backfilled. Thorne will know about the tunnels, Miller said. Thorne knows about the maps, Elena replied. He doesn't know about the site. She closed her eyes, letting the world dissolve into the matrix. She saw the strikers above them, their thermal sensors focused on the fields, not the ground beneath them. She saw the gap in their coverage, a 60-second window every 4 minutes when the lead vehicle's turret rotated to clear its blind spot. When I say go, we move, Elena said. Not to the chapel. We're going to the motor pool. The motor pool, that's right in the middle of the search zone. Exactly, Elena said. They're looking for us to run away. They're not looking for us to run back into the heart of the base. It's the last place Thorne will check because it's the only place that makes no sense. They moved. The crawl was agonizing. Every muscle in Elena's body was screaming for rest, her lungs burning with the humid, stale air. She kept Aria tucked against her, the girl's weight a constant reminder of what was at stake. Aria had closed her eyes again, the silver light fading back to a dull pulse, but her hand was still gripped tightly in Elena's uniform. They reached the intersection. The secondary pipe was narrower, slick with a thick black sludge that smelled of ancient rot. They pushed through it, emerging 20 minutes later in a basement that felt like a tomb. It was the chapel, dusty, smelling of dry rot and forgotten prayers. Elena slumped against a concrete pillar, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at Aria. The girl was pale, her breathing shallow. The internal battery on the respirator was beeping, a low, rhythmic warning. 15 minutes, Elena said. Miller was at the window, peering through the rotted slats. The motor pool is 200 yards across the courtyard. They've got 2 Humvees idling at the gate and a squad of men moving between the sheds. It's a hornet's nest, boss. We don't need a Humvee, Elena said. She stood up, her legs shaking. She looked at Aria. The girl's eyes opened again, and for a brief second the silver turned to a deep, human blue. She looked terrified. It's okay, Elena whispered, brushing a damp lock of hair from the girl's forehead. I've got you, I promise. The promise felt heavy, a debt she wasn't sure she could pay. She looked at Miller. Cover the door, I need 5 minutes. She sat on the floor, holding Aria, and let herself go. She didn't just use the sight, she surrendered to it. She let the data of the base, the movements of the soldiers, the timing of the vehicles, and the frequency of the radio chatter flood into her mind. She became a part of the machine, a ghost in the system. She saw the patterns, the way the soldiers moved in sets of 3. The way the sergeant at the motor pool checked his watch every 10 minutes. The way the lights flickered in the maintenance shed. She found it. A gap. A beautiful, impossible gap in the security created by the very chaos Thorne had unleashed. The MPs were fighting with the 402nd over jurisdictional boundaries. The radio net was a mess of conflicting orders. And in the middle of it all, a single unarmored fuel truck was being prepped for a run to the outlying checkpoints. Miller, she said, her eyes snapping open. The fuel truck, the one with the white cab. I see it, it's guarded, Elena. The guard is a kid, she said. Specialist Holloway, the one from Flight Ops. He was reassigned to the motor pool for the night. He's tired, he's scared, and he doesn't want to be here. You want to hijack a fuel truck with a dying kid in your arms? I want to walk out the front gate, Elena said. And you're going to drive. They didn't sneak, they didn't crawl. Elena wrapped Aria in her own wet ACU jacket, hiding the respirator and the glow. She put on her patrol cap, straightened her collar, and walked out the side door of the chapel as if she were heading to a briefing. Miller followed 2 paces behind, his head down, the perfect image of a weary NCO. The rain was their shield. It blurred the lines of their faces, turned their uniforms into generic shadows. They walked across the courtyard, the mud sucking at their boots. As they approached the motor pool gate, Specialist Holloway stepped out from the guard shack, his rifle held loosely across his chest. He squinted into the rain, his face pale under the amber floodlights. "Halt," he said, but there was no conviction in it. "Base is on lockdown, no unauthorized movement." Elena didn't stop. She kept walking until she was 3 feet from him. She could see the reflection of the rain in his eyes, the way his pupils dilated with fear. "Specialist Holloway," she said, her voice a calm, authoritative blade. "We're on a Priority 1 courier run for Colonel Thorne. This vehicle needs to be at Gate 4 in 5 minutes, or the Colonel is going to have your stripes for breakfast. Do you want to be the one who explains the delay?" Holloway blinked. He recognized her. He remembered the woman from Flight Ops who had looked through him as if he were made of glass. He looked at Miller, then back at Elena. He saw the bundle in her arms, a jacket-trapped shape that could have been anything. "The captain, she's AWOL," Holloway whispered, his hand tightening on his rifle. The radio said. "The radio is wrong, Specialist," Elena said, stepping closer into his personal space. She could smell the cheap coffee on his breath, the scent of a man who was out of his depth. "Think about it. Why would I be walking through the middle of the motor pool if I were running? Use your head. The Colonel needs this delivered. Now, open the gate." The sight showed Elena the moment Holloway's resolve broke. It was a subtle shift in his shoulders, a lowering of the chin. He was 20 years old and he didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to go home. "Yes, ma'am," he muttered, stepping back. He hit the button for the gate. Elena and Miller didn't wait. They moved to the fuel truck, Miller sliding into the driver's seat while Elena climbed into the passenger side, tucking area into the footwell. The engine roared to life, a deep diesel growl that felt like a heartbeat. "Don't look back," Elena said as Miller put the truck in gear. They drove through the gate, the tires splashing through the puddles. Holloway watched them go, a small, lonely figure in the rain. Elena felt a pang of something, guilt perhaps, but she pushed it away. The cost was already too high for sentiment. As they reached the main gate, the tension in the cab was thick enough to choke on. The MPs were out in force, their blue and red lights flashing against the flooded asphalt. A line of vehicles was backed up, soldiers checking IDs and searching trunks. "They are going to search the truck," Miller said, his knuckles white on the wheel. "No, they aren't," Elena said. She reached down and adjusted Aria's respirator. The battery was screaming now, a continuous high-pitched whine that was barely audible over the engine. "The truck is a rolling bomb, Miller. They aren't going to spend 10 minutes searching a tank full of JP-8 while the base is under a perceived terrorist threat. They want the fuel at the checkpoints. They'll wave us through." She was right. The MP at the gate saw the markings on the truck, saw Elena's rank, and barely glanced at the ID. He was more concerned with the 3 strikers idling behind him, their crews shouting for clearance. "Keep it moving, Captain," the MP yelled, waving them through. Miller let out a breath he'd been holding for miles as the truck cleared the perimeter and hit the open road. The lights of Fort Valor faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the dark, empty expanse of the Texas highway. "We're out," Miller whispered. "We're not out," Elena said. "We're just in the open." She pulled Aria up from the footwell, cradling the girl in her lap. The respirator gave one final, dying click and went silent. "Elena, the air!" Miller shouted. Elena didn't panic. She reached for the medical kit she'd taken from the case. She pulled out a manual bag valve mask, the ambu bag, and fitted it over Aria's face. She began to squeeze, providing the breath the girl couldn't take for herself. Asterisk squeeze, 2-3, squeeze, 2-3. Asterisk Aria's eyes flew open. The silver was gone. They were human now, a deep, piercing gray that reminded Elena of the sky before a storm in Steubenville. The girl looked at Elena, and for the first time she smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, a flicker of light in the darkness of the cab. "Thank you," the girl whispered, the words barely audible over the rush of the wind. "I've got you," Elena said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "I've got you, Aria." They drove through the night, the fuel truck a lonely shadow on the highway. They were miles from the base, miles from Thorne, and miles from the life Elena had known. Behind them, the world was already starting to rewrite the story. The reports would say that Captain Elena Vance had suffered a psychotic break, that she had murdered Colonel Thorne and kidnapped a sensitive medical asset. They would say she was a traitor, a criminal, a monster. Elena didn't care. She looked at Miller, his face illuminated by the green glow of the dashboard. He looked older, tired, but there was a peace in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He had made his choice. They both had. "Where are we going?" he asked. Elena looked out at the road ahead, the long, straight line of the highway stretching into the unknown. The sight was quiet now, the probability lines faded. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what was going to happen next, and for the first time in her life, she was okay with that. "West," she said, "until we find someone who can help her." "Who?" "I don't know yet," Elena said, "but we'll find them. We have to." Inside the truck, the rhythm of the ambu bag was the only sound, the steady, mechanical pulse of a life being held together by nothing but will and a promise. The rain continued to fall, washing away the mud of the bombing range, leaving only the cold, hard truth of what they had become. Elena Vance, a woman who had spent her life seeing the patterns of the world, finally understood the cost of being right. It wasn't a medal. It wasn't a promotion. It was the weight of a child's life in her hands and the knowledge that there was no going back. The road ahead was dark, the storm was still raging, and the reckoning was coming. But as she squeezed the bag, providing the breath for the girl who shouldn't exist, Elena felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. It was small. It was quiet. It was dangerous, but it was alive. And in the middle of the Texas night, that was enough. The truck crested a hill, and for a brief second the clouds parted, revealing a single silver star hanging in the west. Elena watched it until the clouds closed again, her hand steady on the bag, her heart steady in her chest. She was still standing. Barely, but she was standing. The immediate crisis had passed, the extraction had failed, and they were free for now. But the world they had left behind was already searching for them, its vast, mechanical eyes turning toward the west. Thorne was still alive, the 402nd was still mobilized, and the secret of Area was still a debt that had to be paid. "Stay with me, Area," Elena whispered. The girl's hand tightened on hers, a tiny, cold grip that felt like the strongest thing in the world. "I'm here," Area whispered, and as the sun began to bleed through the eastern horizon, a thin line of gray light in a world of shadows, the fuel truck disappeared into the distance, leaving nothing behind but the smell of rain and the echo of a heartbeat. The story wasn't over. The battle was just beginning. But as Elena Vance looked out at the rising sun, she knew one thing for certain. The metal didn't care if she was burning. And she wasn't done with the turn. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of the miles they had yet to travel. Miller didn't ask for instructions. He didn't ask for a plan. He just drove, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands steady on the wheel. He was a man who had seen the worst of the world and decided to fight anyway, and in that moment, Elena knew she couldn't have asked for a better partner. They were two ghosts in a stolen truck, carrying a secret that could change everything. And as the world woke up to the news of the Fort Valor incident, they were already gone, lost in the vast, beautiful indifference of the American landscape. The cost would be tallied later. The reckoning would come in the light of day. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, they had the road, they had each other, and they had the girl. And that, Elena realized, was more than she had ever hoped for. She closed her eyes for a second, letting the hum of the engine vibrate through her tired body. She didn't dream, she didn't see the sight. She just felt the warmth of the child in her lap and the steady, rhythmic breath of the ambu bag. She was a soldier. She was a protector. She was Elena Vance, and she was ready for whatever came next. The truck moved on, a small, defiant speck in the vastness of Texas, heading toward a future that had yet to be written. The road was long, the stakes were high, and the world was watching. But as the first rays of the sun hit the windshield, turning the raindrops into tiny, glowing diamonds, Elena knew they were going to make it. They had to. Because the girl was smiling. And for the first time, the silver eyes were bright with hope. The end of the beginning was over. The real story was just starting, and Elena Vance was the one holding the pen. She looked at Miller and he nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the path they had chosen. They weren't just running anymore. They were moving toward something real, something true. And as the fuel truck disappeared into the golden light of the morning, the only sound left in the air was the steady, unwavering beat of a human heart. One breath at a time, 1 mile at a time, one choice at a time. The cost was worth it, and Elena Vance was finally, truly free. The dawn was coming, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what it would reveal. Because she knew who she was. She was the one who stayed, she was the one who fought. She was the one who saved the heart of the world, and she would do it again, without hesitation, without regret, because that was the mission, and Elena Vance never, ever failed the mission. The truck turned onto a dirt road, kicking up a cloud of red dust that glowed in the morning light. They were deep in the hill country now, far from the highways and the eyes of the satellites. They were safe, at least for a while. Elena looked down at Arya, who was sleeping now, her head resting against Elena's chest. The violet glow was gone, replaced by the soft, healthy flush of a child who was finally at peace. "We're here," Miller said, pulling the truck to a stop in front of a small, weathered farmhouse nestled in a grove of oak trees. Elena looked at the house, then back at Miller. "Who lives here?" she asked. "An old friend," Miller said. "Someone who knows how to keep a secret." Elena nodded. She stepped out of the truck, cradling Arya in her arms. The air was cool and fresh, the scent of wet earth and cedar filling her lungs. It was a beautiful morning. She walked toward the house, her boots crunching on the gravel. She didn't look back at the truck or the road or the life she had left behind. She only looked forward toward the woman standing on the porch, a woman with kind eyes and a steady hand. "Welcome home, Elena," the woman said. Elena smiled. She wasn't home, not yet, but she was close. She walked up the steps, and as the door opened to let them in, the first light of the new day filled the room, chasing away the shadows of the night. The story was still unfolding. The battle was still raging. But for now, in this quiet, forgotten corner of the world, they were safe. And that was all that mattered. Elena Vance took a final breath of the morning air and stepped inside, closing the door on the world behind her. She was ready. For the reckoning, for the future, for everything. And she was not alone. The serious incident report hit the desk of Lieutenant General Silas Vance, no relation, though the coincidence was a recurring joke in the Pentagon's E-ring, at 0415 on a damp Wednesday morning. It was a single, heavy folder, the kind of paper that felt colder than the room, marked with a scarlet top-secret /Orkin cover sheet that seemed to bleed into the mahogany. Outside the reinforced windows, Washington, D.C., was a blurred landscape of gray marble and rain-slicked asphalt, but inside the office the air was sterile, smelling of high-grade toner and the burnt sugar scent of a fresh pot of Colombian roast. General Vance didn't touch the coffee. He didn't touch the report for a long time. He simply stared at the name typed in the subject line, Captain Elena N. Vance. He remembered her from a graduation ceremony at West Point 3 years prior. He remembered the way she'd looked through him, not with disrespect, but with a level of focus that felt like a physical pressure. She had been the top of her class in every metric that mattered, and several that didn't. And now, according to the 300 pages of preliminary evidence gathered by the Criminal Investigation Division, she was the most dangerous fugitive in the United States Army. The institutional machinery of the Department of Defense does not move quickly, except when it feels a threat to its own structural integrity. By 0600, the Fort Valor incident had been scrubbed from the local police scanners and replaced with a classified directive that bypassed the standard chain of command. In a windowless briefing room at Fort Sam Houston, a dozen men and women in various shades of OCP and charcoal suits sat in a silence so profound it felt like a vacuum. On the wall-sized monitors, a grainy, thermal loop video from a gate camera at Fort Valor played on a repeat that nobody could stop watching. It showed a white cab fuel truck rolling through a checkpoint with the measured, terrifying confidence of a predator disguised as a scavenger. Major Sarah Hauer, a JAG officer with 15 years of experience in rooting out internal corruption, watched the screen until the pixels burned into her retinas. She wasn't looking at the truck. She was looking at the woman in the passenger seat. Even through the digital noise and the rain-streaked glass, Captain Elena Vance looked composed. That was the word that kept surfacing in Hauer's mind. Not desperate, not panicked, composed. It was the look of a woman who had performed a complex mathematical equation and found the only possible solution, even if that solution involved burning down her entire life. "We have a confirmed casualty count of 4, a voice said from the shadows of the room. It was Colonel Miller, not Elena's partner, but a different Miller, a man from Intelligence and Security Command who looked like he hadn't slept since the Cold War. "Thorne is in the ICU at Brooke Army Medical Center. Severe burns, multiple fractures, and internal bleeding. He's stable, but he won't be talking to anyone for 48 hours. The other 3 are dead. 1 sniper, 1 MP, 1 civilian contractor found in the wreckage of the Jeep. All killed with surgical precision. This wasn't a breakout, Sarah. It was an extraction." "And the asset?" Hauer asked, her voice sounding thin in the pressurized room. "Missing, along with Sergeant Major Miller. He's got 24 years of clean service, a Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars with Valor. He was 6 months from retirement." Hauer leaned back, the leather of her chair creaking like a warning. "You don't throw away 24 years for a captain's psychotic break. You don't help her steal a classified medical payload because she had a bad day. Miller saw something. He chose a side. The Army is the only side, the intelligence colonel snapped. The narrative is already set. We've issued a bolo to every state trooper from here to the Pacific. The FBI is standing by to take the lead the moment they cross state lines. The official story is that Captain Vance suffered a catastrophic mental collapse due to combat-related stress, murdered her commanding officer, and kidnapped a child who was part of a sensitive witness protection program. That is the story the world gets. The truth is restricted to this room. The truth being that we lost a biological anomaly with no name and no paper trail, Howard whispered. The truth, the colonel said, leaning into the light, is that we are going to find her. And when we do, we are going to ensure that whatever she thinks she's doing ends immediately. The institution survives, Major. Individuals are replaceable. But as the meeting broke up and the room emptied, Howard stayed behind, watching the fuel truck disappear into the static of the gate camera over and over again. She knew Elena Vance's record. She knew the woman's father had been a master sergeant in the Rangers who died in a training accident at Benning. She knew Elena had grown up in the shadow of the flag, a child of the base, a creature of the institution. People like that didn't just break. They were broken. And she wondered, with a cold pit forming in her stomach, what kind of hammer it had taken to shatter a woman like Elena Vance. 500 miles away, in the quiet, pre-dawn shadows of a hill country farmhouse that hadn't seen a coat of paint since the Bush administration, the personal cost of the break was being tallied in a much more visceral way. Elena sat on the edge of a clawfoot bathtub, her teeth clenched so hard she thought her jaw might fracture. The bathroom smelled of mildew, rusted iron, and the sharp, antiseptic sting of the rubbing alcohol she had just poured over the 3-inch gash in her shoulder. The wound was angry, a jagged, pulsing reminder of the Jeep's impact and the desperate crawl through the drainage pipes. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the way her body felt like it was vibrating on a frequency she couldn't control. The site had been active for too long, and now the world was refusing to go back to being a normal, three-dimensional space. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the thermal signatures of the birds in the trees outside. She heard the electrical hum of the farmhouse's old wiring behind the plaster. It was an assault of data, a relentless flood of information that her brain was struggling to filter. She gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles white, and waited for the tremors in her hands to stop. They didn't. They were fine, microscopic shudders, the kind of thing a sniper would recognize as the end of a career. Captain. Miller was standing in the doorway. He was still wearing his wet ACUs, the fabric darkened by mud and oil, but he had stripped off his tactical vest. He looked 10 years older than he had 12 hours ago. His eyes, usually as sharp as flint, were clouded with a fatigue that went beyond the physical. He was holding a clean towel and a roll of duct tape. "I'm fine, Sergeant Major," Elena said, her voice sounding like it was coming from someone else, someone far away. "You're not fine. You're shaking like a leaf in a hurricane," Miller said, his voice a low, steady anchor. He didn't wait for permission. He stepped into the small bathroom and took the alcohol-soaked cotton from her hand. "You did the math for the escape, Elena. You did the math for the gate. But you didn't do the math for what happens when the adrenaline wears off." He began to clean the wound. His hands were steady, a miracle of muscle memory and discipline. He had spent his life patching up men in valleys where the sun never reached, and he treated the captain with the same rough, unsentimental care. "The girl?" Elena asked, her breath hitching as the alcohol bit into the muscle. "Sleeping in the guest room. Clara's watching her. She's different, Elena. The glow is gone, but the air around her feels wrong, like there's a static charge in the room. Clara won't say it, but she's scared." "She should be," Elena whispered. "We all should be." She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken and rimmed with the red of exhaustion. There was a smear of dried blood on her temple that looked like a tattoo. This was the cost. It wasn't just the rank she had lost or the career she had spent a decade building. It was the fundamental belief that she was one of the good guys. She had spent her life believing in the chain of command, in the sanctity of the mission, in the idea that the army was a shield. Now she was the one the shield was meant to crush. She had stepped outside the circle, and the cold out here was more than she had anticipated. "Miller," she said, her voice cracking. "What did I do to you?" Miller stopped taping the bandage. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. There was no resentment there, no regret, only a terrifying, quiet clarity. You gave me a reason to be a soldier again, Captain, he said. For 20 years I've been following orders. Some were good, some were bad. Some made me sick to my stomach when I tried to sleep. But this, saving that kid, this is the first time in a long time I've felt like I wasn't just a part of a machine. I'm a man, Elena, and I made a man's choice. Don't you dare take that away from me by feeling sorry for it. He finished the bandage and stepped back, giving her the space she needed to breathe. Clara's making eggs, real ones, not the powdered shit from the mess. You need to eat. Your body is cannibalizing itself to keep that site of yours running. Eat, then sleep. We move at sunset. Elena nodded, but she didn't move. She stayed on the edge of the tub long after Miller had left, listening to the sound of the rain on the tin roof. She thought about Colonel Thorne. She thought about the look in his eyes when the first latch had popped. It wasn't the look of a man who was doing something wrong. It was the look of a man who believed he was doing something necessary. That was the most dangerous thing in the world, a man with a moral compass that pointed toward the institution instead of toward the truth. She stood up, her legs feeling like they were made of glass, and walked out into the hallway. The farmhouse was small, filled with the cluttered, comfortable debris of a life lived in one place. Photos of grandchildren on the mantel, a worn Bible on the coffee table, the smell of frying bacon. It was so aggressively normal it made her head ache. She stopped at the door to the guest room. It was cracked open an inch. She peered inside and felt the sight flare instinctively. Arya was curled into a ball in the center of a massive, quilted bed. She looked tiny, a pale ghost in a room full of floral patterns. But the sight didn't see a child. It saw a nexus of energy, a swirling, violet-tinged distortion in the air that seemed to pull at the light in the room. Arya wasn't breathing like a human. It was a rhythmic, oscillating cycle that matched the hum Elena had heard in the wiring. As if sensing the observation, the girl's eyes snapped open. They were still gray, the human gray, but they were wide and knowing. She didn't move, but the temperature in the hallway dropped 5 degrees. "They're looking for us," Arya said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the inflection of a child. It sounded like a recording of a voice. "I know," Elena said. "They're using the big eyes," the girl continued, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. "The ones that see the heat. They're looking for the purple light, but I'm hiding it. I'm making myself small." Elena walked into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't touch the girl, not yet. The memory of the electric shock in the drainage pipe was still fresh in her mind. "Arya, what did they do to you at Hangar 12? The girl finally looked at her. For a second, the gray shifted, a flash of that mercury silver swirling in the iris. "They wanted to see how the world looks to me. They wanted to take the patterns out of my head and put them into the boxes, but the boxes aren't big enough. They kept breaking." She reached out a hand, her fingers small and delicate, and touched the bandage on Elena's shoulder. Elena braced herself for the shock, but it didn't come. Instead, there was a wave of coolness, a soothing, numbing sensation that felt like an ice pack on a fever. "You're like me," Arya whispered. "You see the threads, but your threads are heavy. They're tied to things that are gone." "I'm a soldier, Arya," Elena said, more to herself than the girl. "I'm supposed to be tied to things." "Not anymore," the girl said. "Now you're just the one who stays." The silence that followed was broken by the heavy footfalls of Miller in the kitchen and the muffled sound of a television. Elena stood up, the cooling sensation in her shoulder already beginning to fade, replaced by a dull, manageable ache. She walked into the living room and found Miller standing in front of an old, boxy TV. "Authorities are warning the public not to approach Captain Vance, who is believed to be armed and extremely dangerous," the news anchor was saying, her face a mask of professional concern. "A massive manhunt is underway across 3 states, led by the FBI's elite hostage rescue team. Sources indicate that Vance may be suffering from a severe dissociative episode." Miller hit the power button. The screen faded to a single white dot before disappearing. "They're painting you as a monster, boss," he said, his back to her. "I expected that," Elena said. She walked to the window and pulled the curtain back just a fraction. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The woods surrounding the farmhouse were thick and dark, a wall of cedar and oak that felt like a cage. "They'll find the truck," she said. "The fuel truck was too big to hide for long. They'll track it to the junction where we swap for Clara's station wagon. They'll have the plates. They'll have the description. We have maybe 4 hours before the first perimeter starts to close." "Clara's already clearing out the cellar," Miller said. "It's an old storm shelter. Lead-lined, mostly. The farmers around here used to worry about more than just tornadoes in the 50s. It might buy us some time from the SAR satellites." "It won't be enough," Elena said. She turned back to him, her face set in the hard, angular lines of command. Thorn knows me. He knows I won't just run. He knows I'll try to get her to someone who can help. He's already thinking 3 steps ahead. He's not looking for a truck anymore. He's looking for a destination. And what is the destination, Captain? Elena looked at the girl in the other room. She thought about the data she had seen in Thorn's office, the encrypted files she had downloaded into the tablet before the world turned to fire. There was a name in those files, a name that hadn't been in the briefings. A facility in New Mexico, hidden in the shadow of the White Sands missile range. A place called Asterisk the Well Asterisk. We're going to the one place they think we'd be too smart to go, Elena said. We're going to the source. The reckoning for the men who had stayed behind at Fort Valor was less about physical pain and more about the slow, agonizing realization of their own obsolescence. Colonel Thorn sat in his hospital bed, his face a landscape of white gauze and silver nitrate. He was alone. The guards at the door weren't there to protect him. They were there to ensure he didn't talk to anyone who hadn't been cleared by the Pentagon. He looked at the report on his lap, the one that detailed the death of the sniper on the observation tower. 1 shot, 450 meters, in a tropical depression, with an unzeroed rifle. He had known Vance was gifted. He had known her sight. A term he had coined himself in the classified journals he kept in his safe was a tactical asset of immeasurable value. But he had underestimated the scale of it. He had treated her like a tool, a precision instrument that could be recalibrated or replaced. He hadn't realized that the instrument had a soul. The door opened, and a man in a crisp, dark suit walked in. He didn't have a name tag, he didn't have a rank. He just had a look of profound disappointment that made Thorn's heart skip a beat. "The director is not pleased, Marcus," the man said. He sat in the plastic chair by the bed, his movements elegant and practiced. "We gave you $1 billion of research and the most secure facility in the Western Hemisphere. You lost both in a single night because you couldn't control a 30-year-old captain." "She wasn't just a captain," Thorn rasped, the words catching in his scorched throat. "She was the only one who could see the asset for what it was. I thought I could use that. I thought I could bridge the gap between the child and the data." "You thought wrong," the man said. "And now the child is in the wind. The captain is a martyr for anyone with a grudge against the military-industrial complex. And you are a liability." "I can find her," Thorn said, leaning forward, his hands trembling on the bedsheets. "I know how she thinks. I know where she's going. You're going to stay in this bed, Marcus. You're going to recover, and then you're going to sign a series of documents that state you were never at Fort Valor. You were never part of Project Area. You were an administrator at a logistics hub who had a tragic accident during a fuel transfer exercise. You're burying it." Thorn's voice was a ghost of a scream. "You can't bury her. She's the greatest threat to national security we've ever faced." "We aren't burying it," the man said, standing up. "We're handing it over to the professionals. You were a scientist with a uniform, Marcus. We're sending in the wolves now, and when they find Captain Vance, they aren't going to bring her back for questioning." The man walked out, the click of the door sounding like the fall of a gavel. Thorn lay back, staring at the white ceiling. He had spent his life building a legacy, a monument to human progress and national defense. Now he was being erased. He had been wrong about Elena Vance, but he had also been wrong about the institution he served. It didn't care about his loyalty. It didn't care about his brilliance. It only cared about its own survival. And in the cold, antiseptic light of the ICU, he realized that he and Elena were finally on the same side of the ledger. They were both expendable. Back at the farmhouse, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the porch. Elena stood in the kitchen, watching Clara, Miller's sister-in-law, a woman with a face like a topographical map of West Texas, pack a cooler with sandwiches and water. Clara didn't ask questions. She had been a military wife for 30 years before her husband died of lung cancer in a VA hospital. She knew how to recognize a mission when she saw one. She also knew how to recognize the look of a woman who was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "You look like you're about to snap, honey," Clara said, her voice like sandpaper on silk. She handed Elena a thermos of coffee. "You need to take a breath, not for you, for the girl." "I don't have time for breaths, Clara," Elena said. "You have time for what you make time for," Clara said. She reached out and took Elena's hand. Her skin was dry and warm, the touch of a human being who wasn't afraid of the truth. "That girl, she's looking at you like you're the only thing left in the world that's solid. If you break, she goes with you. You remember that when you're out there in the dark." Elena looked down at their joined hands. For a fleeting second, the sight tried to show her the chemical composition of Clara's skin, the rate of her heart, the microscopic tremors in her fingers. Elena shoved it back. She forced herself to just feel the warmth, just the touch. "I'll remember," Elena said. "Good, now get out of here. The sheriff's deputy usually cruises this road around 7. He's a good boy, but he's got a radio and he's been told to look for strangers." Miller came into the room, his gear packed into 2 nondescript duffel bags. He looked at Elena, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. "Let's go," she said. They moved area to the back of the station wagon, a 2012 Subaru that smelled of old dog and pine needles. The girl didn't say a word. She sat in the middle of the seat, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the darkening woods. As Miller climbed into the driver's seat and Elena took the passenger side, the silence in the car felt heavy, a physical presence that pressed against their chests. They drove down the long, gravel driveway, the headlights of the Subaru cutting a path through the gloom. Clara stood on the porch, a small, resolute figure framed by the light of the house. She didn't wave. She just watched them go, her silhouette fading into the darkness until there was nothing left but the red glow of the taillights. "We're on the clock," Miller said, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "We need to hit the interstate before the checkpoints are fully established. If we stay on the back roads, we're targets." "Take the 290 West," Elena said, her tablet open on her lap. The screen was dimmed to the lowest setting, the maps of the Texas interior unfolding in a series of green and blue lines. "We'll bypass Fredericksburg and head toward Junction. From there, it's open country all the way to the border." "The border?" "Not that border," Elena said. "The New Mexico line. We need to be in the desert by dawn." As they hit the main road, Elena felt the first real wave of the personal cost arriving in full. It wasn't the pain in her shoulder or the exhaustion in her mind. It was the crushing realization of what she was leaving behind. She had spent 15 years in a uniform. She had a house in Killeen with a mortgage and a lawn she liked to mow on Saturday mornings. She had a dog, a golden retriever named Max, who was currently at a kennel in Austin, wondering when she was coming home. She had a mother in Ohio who sent her care packages of homemade cookies and newspaper clippings about local high school football. All of it was gone. In the eyes of the law, she was a murderer. In the eyes of her family, she was a tragedy. She couldn't call home. She couldn't send an email. She was a ghost, a glitch in the system that was being systematically deleted. She looked at Miller. He was focused on the road, his face illuminated by the green glow of the dashboard. He had lost even more. He had a pension waiting for him. He had a reputation that was beyond reproach. He had a sister-in-law who had just risked her freedom to give them a head start. He was throwing it all away for a woman he barely knew and a girl who might not even be human. "Miller," she said, her voice a whisper. "Don't," he said, not looking at her. "I know what you're going to say, and the answer is the same as it was in the bathroom. We're doing this all the way to the end." Elena turned her gaze back to the window. The Texas landscape was a blur of dark trees and occasional farmhouse lights. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness, a feeling so deep it made her chest ache. She had always been the one in control, the one with the answers, the one who could see the patterns before anyone else. But now she was just a woman in a stolen car, running through the night with a secret she didn't fully understand. The road stretched out before them, a black ribbon of uncertainty. Behind them, the institution was mobilizing its vast, impersonal resources. The wolves were on the scent. The satellites were turning. The radio waves were filled with her name. She reached back and touched Aria's knee. The girl's skin was cool, but there was a faint, steady pulse beneath the surface, a heartbeat that felt like a promise. "Stay with me," Elena whispered. "I'm here," Aria said. They drove through the night, the miles clicking away on the odometer like a countdown. They bypassed the small towns, the gas stations, the roadside diners. They stayed in the shadows, a ghost ship sailing through a sea of indifference. Around midnight, they reached the Pecos River. The bridge was a dark, skeletal structure spanning a gorge that looked bottomless in the moonlight. Miller slowed the car, his eyes searching the darkness for any sign of a roadblock. "Clear," he muttered, accelerating across the bridge. The sound of the tires on the metal grate was a rhythmic, industrial drumming that seemed to echo in Elena's skull. She felt the sight flare again, unbidden. She saw the structural weaknesses of the bridge. She saw the fish moving in the dark water below. She saw the heat signature of a coyote watching them from the brush on the far bank. And then she saw something else. A distortion in the air miles ahead. A ripple in the probability matrix that made her stomach churn. It wasn't a physical object. It was a presence, a gathering of energy that felt cold and clinical and utterly relentless. "Miller, stop," she said. "What is it?" "Something's wrong up ahead about 5 miles out." "I don't see anything, boss." "I do," Elena said, her voice trembling with the effort of holding the sight together. "They are waiting for us, not the police, not the army, something else." She looked at the tablet, her fingers fly across the screen. The maps were clear, but the data was shifting. The frequencies were being jammed. The GPS was starting to drift. "They've found us," she said. "How? We swapped the car, we stayed off the main arteries." "The girl," Elena said, looking back at Arya. "They aren't tracking the car, Miller, they're tracking the signal. Arya, she's a beacon. No matter how small she tries to make herself, she's still a part of the machine. And the machine wants its part back." Arya looked at her, her gray eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry, I tried to hide, I tried so hard." "It's okay," Elena said, her voice softening. "It's not your fault." She looked at Miller. The sergeant major's face was a mask of grim determination. He knew the odds, he knew what was coming. "What's the play, Captain?" he asked. Elena looked out at the dark, unforgiving landscape of the Trans-Picos. To the north, the Davis Mountains rose like a jagged wall. To the south, the desert stretched out toward the Rio Grande. "We go off-road," she said. "We head for the mountains. If we can get into the high country, the terrain might interfere with their tracking. It's our only chance." "The Subaru won't make it in the high desert, Elena. It's a city car." "Then we walk," she said. Miller nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. He just turned the wheel, steering the station wagon off the asphalt and onto a narrow, rutted track that led into the heart of the darkness. The car bounced and groaned as it hit the uneven ground, the headlights dancing wildly across the scrub brush and the cacti. Elena gripped the door handle, her heart pounding against her ribs. This was it, the moment of no return. They were leaving the road, leaving the world, leaving everything behind. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the air grew thinner and colder. The smell of cedar and dust filled the car, a sharp, wild scent that felt like a challenge. Elena watched the monitor on her tablet, watching the blue dot of their location move slowly away from the highway. Behind them, on the road they had just left, a series of dark, silent vehicles pulled to a stop. No sirens, no lights, just the quiet, methodical movement of men who knew exactly what they were doing. In the lead vehicle, a man with a headset and a screen full of pulsing violet data looked out at the mountains. "They've gone off-road," he said into his microphone. "Sector 4, moving toward the ridge." "Copy that," a voice replied, cold and metallic. "Deploy the drones, terminate the extraction, execute the primary directive." "Understood," the man said. In the back of the Subaru, Arya reached out and took Elena's hand. Her grip was tight, her small fingers digging into Elena's skin. "They're coming," she whispered. "I know," Elena said. She looked at Miller, then back at the girl. She felt a sudden, fierce wave of protectiveness, a feeling that burned hotter than the sight, hotter than the adrenaline, hotter than the fear. She was a soldier. She was a protector. And she wasn't going to let them have her. Not tonight. Not ever. The car hit a deep rut and stalled, the engine giving one final, sputtering gasp before dying. The silence that followed was absolute, a weight that seemed to press down on the car from all sides. "That's it," Miller said, his voice a low, steady vibration. "End of the line for the Subaru." He grabbed the duffel bags from the back and stepped out into the cold mountain air. Elena followed, pulling Arya out with her. The girl looked up at the stars, her face pale in the moonlight. "The threads are everywhere now," Arya whispered. Elena looked up. She saw them too, not with her eyes, but with the sight. The sky was crisscrossed with lines of light, the paths of the satellites, the frequencies of the drones, the invisible web of the world that was trying to pull them back in. But as she looked at Miller and then at the girl, she saw another thread. A thin, glowing line that led up into the high peaks, a path of probability that was narrow and dangerous and entirely theirs. "This way," Elena said, pointing toward the ridge. They began to climb. The mountain was a landscape of loose rock and thorny brush, a physical obstacle that seemed designed to break them. Elena's shoulder was screaming, every step a jolt of pain that made her vision blur. Miller carried the bags, his breath coming in steady, rhythmic huffs, his strength a silent, unwavering support. They moved in silence, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the stone and the occasional rattle of a disturbed pebble. Elena led the way, her mind a map of the terrain, her sight guiding them through the darkness. She felt the first drone before she heard it, a ripple in the air, a displacement of space. "Get down," she hissed. They dropped into the shadows of a large boulder as the drone swept overhead. It was a sleek, black shape, a silent predator with a thermal eye that was scanning the ground with terrifying precision. Elena held her breath, her heart hammering against the rock. She felt Aria's hand on her arm, the girl's energy humming with a low, vibrating intensity. "It's looking for the purple," Aria whispered. "Can you hide it?" Elena asked. "I'm trying, but the threads are so tight." The drone circled once, twice, its red sensor light bathing the ground in a bloody glow. Elena watched it with the sight, watching the probability of detection shift from 20% to 40 to 60. She closed her eyes and focused. She didn't just see the drone, she saw the frequency it was using to communicate with its base. She saw the data stream, a thin, pulsing line of light that was vulnerable to interference. She reached out with her mind, using the sight as a weapon. She didn't try to crash the drone. She just nudged the data, a small, microscopic shift in the thermal calibration, a tiny, momentary glitch in the sensor feed. The drone's sensor light flickered, then shifted away, its eye focusing on a patch of warm rock 50 yards to their left. It lingered for a second, then accelerated, its mission redirected by a ghost in the machine. Elena slumped against the boulder, her head spinning, a sharp, stabbing pain behind her eyes. The cost of using the sight like that was high, a physical toll that felt like a hammer blow to her skull. "You okay, boss?" Miller whispered. "I'm fine," she said, though the world was tilting dangerously. "But they're not going to stop. That was just the first one." "Then we need to move faster," Miller said. They climbed higher, the air growing colder and the terrain more treacherous. The moon was a pale, uncaring eye in the sky, watching their slow, agonizing progress. As they reached the crest of the ridge, the world opened up before them. To the west, the desert stretched out like a dark, silver sea, the lights of a distant town twinkling like fallen stars. To the east, the plains were a shadow, a vast, empty expanse that felt like the end of the world. But it was the sight to the north that made Elena stop. A cluster of lights on the horizon, not a town, not a base. A single glowing point of blue and white that seemed to pulse with a steady, artificial heartbeat. "The well," Aria whispered. Elena looked at the girl. Aria was standing at the edge of the ridge, her hair blowing in the wind, her eyes fixed on the distant light. For a second, the violet glow returned, a soft, ethereal shimmer that surrounded her like a halo. "Is that where we're going?" Miller asked. "That's where it ends," Elena said. She looked back at the mountain they had just climbed. Far below, she saw the lights of the pursuit. A line of vehicles, their headlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of a wolf pack. They were moving slow, hindered by the terrain, but they were coming. She looked at Miller. He saw them too. He didn't look afraid, he just looked ready. "We have about 3 hours of moonlight left," he said. "If we move now, we can hit the valley floor by dawn." "Then let's move," Elena said. As they began the descent, Elena felt a sudden, sharp clarity wash over her. The pain was still there. The exhaustion was still there. The fear was still there. But beneath it all, there was a new feeling. A sense of purpose that was stronger than anything she had ever felt before. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She wasn't just a fugitive. She was the one who was going to finish this. She looked at Aria and the girl smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to bridge the gap between their two worlds. "We're almost there," Aria said. "I know," Elena replied. They moved into the shadows of the mountain, 3 figures disappearing into the dark, heading toward a destination that was both a beginning and an end. The institution was still searching. The wolves were still hunting. The world was still watching. But as the first light of the new day began to bleed through the eastern horizon, Elena Vance didn't look back. She only looked forward toward the glowing point of blue and white and the future that was waiting for them in the heart of the desert. The reckoning was coming, and for the first time she was the one who was going to deliver it. One breath at a time, one choice at a time, 1 mile at a time. The cost was paid, and the mission was just beginning. The gravel shifted under Elena's left boot with a sound like grinding teeth. A sharp, treacherous rattle that seemed to echo across the entire basin of the Trans-Picos. She froze, her hand snapping out to catch Aria's shoulder, her fingers feeling the thin, brittle warmth of the girl's collarbone through the oversized denim jacket Clara had provided. 20 yards ahead, Miller stopped mid-stride, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the pre-dawn gray of the desert floor. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. He just tilted his head, listening to the way the wind hissed through the saltcedar and the creosote, waiting for the sound of a bolt cycling or the faint, electronic chirp of a radio that shouldn't be there. The air smelled of cold sand and the metallic tang of an approaching storm, but underneath it, Elena's sight picked up the ozone stink of high-voltage capacitors charging somewhere in the distance. They were 4 miles from the perimeter of the well, and the world was beginning to scream in a language only Elena could hear. "The ground is humming," Arya whispered, her voice so low it was almost lost to the wind. She wasn't looking at the horizon. She was looking at her own feet, her eyes wide and reflecting a violet light that wasn't coming from the sky. "It's the big boxes. They're calling. They're asking where the pieces went." "Don't answer them," Elena said, her voice a dry rasp. She adjusted the strap of the stolen M4 carbine slung across her chest, the weight of the weapon a familiar, punishing comfort. Her shoulder was a throbbing knot of fire, the bandage soaked through with a mixture of sweat and old blood, but she pushed the sensation into a small, locked room in the back of her mind. She had been trained at West Point and Fort Benning to manage pain as a logistical variable, but this was different. The sight was no longer a tool she could toggle on and off. It was a flood. The probability matrices were overlapping now, showing her 3 different versions of the next 10 seconds. In one, a drone spotted them. In another, Miller tripped a seismic sensor buried in the silt. In the third, they made it to the arroyo. "Miller," she called softly. The sergeant major drifted back toward them, his movements fluid despite the heavy ruck and the 24 years of hard miles on his knees. He knelt in the dirt, his eyes scanning the ridgeline behind them. "The drones are cycling, 10-minute intervals. They're using a staggered pattern, boss. Someone back at Sam Houston is playing the long game. They're not looking for a heat signature anymore. They're looking for the lack of one. They're looking for the holes we're leaving in the wind." "We're not going to make the gate," Elena said. She looked toward the blue-white pulse on the horizon. From this distance, the well looked like an industrial scar on the desert, a cluster of low-slung concrete bunkers and venting towers surrounded by a forest of high-gain antennas. "The internal sensors are linked to the asset's biometric frequency. The moment area crosses the 500-meter mark, every door in that facility will lock down. They'll have us in a kill box before we can even see the glass." Miller wiped a smear of dust from his forehead, his face a landscape of deep-set lines and quiet resolve. "So we don't go through the gate. You saw the blueprints in Thorne's files. The cooling intake for the primary reactor comes from the aquifer. 3 miles of reinforced pipe leading to a pump station in the valley. It's tight, but it's not monitored for human entry because nobody is supposed to know it exists. It's a suicide squeeze," Elena said. "If the pumps cycle while we're inside, we're pulverized." "I've spent half my career in holes I wasn't supposed to be in, Captain," Miller said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'm not about to stop now. Besides, I like the odds. Better to be drowned by a machine than shot by a kid I probably trained at Bragg." Elena looked at Arya. The girl was staring at the facility, her small hands balled into fists. The violet shimmer around her was growing more intense, a localized distortion that made the air look like it was boiling. Arya wasn't a victim anymore. She was a beacon, a living piece of technology that was trying to return to its source. The institution hadn't just experimented on her. They had woven her into the fundamental architecture of the place. "They're not just boxes, Arya," Elena said, crouching down to the girl's level. "It's a cage. Do you understand? If we go in there, I'm not bringing you back to the doctors. I'm going to break the cage. And when I do, the light might go out. You might just be a regular girl, no threads, no patterns, just you." Arya looked at her, and for the first time the gray in her eyes was clear, devoid of the swirling mercury. "Will I still see you?" "Yes," Elena said, the word catching in her throat. "You'll still see me." "Then break it," the girl said. They moved with the sun at their backs, a tactical crawl through the jagged shadows of the arroyo. Elena led the way, her sight acting as a minesweeper for the invisible. She saw the infrared tripwires before they touched them, the beams appearing as solid crimson bars in the air. She saw the vibrations of the seismic sensors as ripples in the sand, like stones dropped into a still pond. She guided Miller and Arya through a labyrinth of electronic traps, her brain screaming from the effort of processing the sheer volume of data. It was like trying to navigate a minefield while someone recited the digits of pi into both ears. By the time they reached the pump station, a nondescript concrete shack half buried in a sand dune. Elena's nose was bleeding, a thin, dark trickle that she wiped away with the back of her hand. Miller jimmied the lock with the practiced ease of a man who had forgotten more about breaking and entering than most burglars ever knew. The interior of the shack was a cathedral of industrial noise, the roar of the massive turbines vibrating in their marrow. The air was thick with the smell of grease and stagnant water. "The intake is behind the secondary filter," Miller shouted over the din. He pointed to a circular steel hatch bolted into the floor. "Once we're in, we've got 18 minutes before the next pressure surge. We don't stop. We don't look back. We keep moving until we hit the maintenance ladder in Section 7. He grabbed a heavy wrench from a tool rack and began to loosen the bolts. Elena stood by the door, her rifle leveled at the sliver of desert visible through the cracked window. The sight showed her the wolves. They were close now. 3 Black Hawk helicopters were banking low over the southern ridge, their rotors kicking up plumes of dust that looked like ghosts in the infrared. They weren't using their searchlights. They were using the big eyes, the multispectral sensors that could see the heat of a human heart through 6 feet of sand. "They're here," Elena said. "Almost. Got." Miller grunted, the wrench slipping before catching again. With a final, agonizing groan of metal, the hatch popped open. A rush of cold, damp air hit them, smelling of wet stone and ancient earth. Miller dropped a chemlight into the hole. It fell for 20 feet before splashing into a shallow pool of water. "Go, now." Elena grabbed Arya and lowered her into the darkness, the girl's small boots splashing into the water below. "Stay close to the wall," Elena whispered. "Don't let go of the rungs." She followed, her boots clanging against the rusted iron ladder. Above her, Miller was the last one in, pulling the hatch shut and sliding the bolts back into place just as the first rotor wash began to rattle the tin roof of the shack. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the pumps and the sound of their own breathing. The tunnel was a lightless tube of reinforced concrete, barely 4 feet in diameter. They had to move in a crouched, agonizing waddle, the water swirling around their ankles. Elena took the lead, her sight the only lamp they had. In the darkness, the threads were even more vivid. The electrical conduits running alongside the pipe appeared as glowing veins of gold, the structural stress points as fractures of deep purple. 6 minutes, Miller's voice echoed from behind her. He was carrying the girl now, Arya's head tucked into the crook of his neck. The tunnel began to narrow. The air grew thinner, the oxygen being sucked away by the massive turbines deeper in the facility. Elena felt a wave of vertigo, her vision doubling as the sight struggled to reconcile the physical walls with the energy patterns pulsing through the concrete. She felt the pressure changing in her ears. The surge was coming. "We're not going to make the ladder," she gasped, her lungs burning. "Keep moving, Captain, that's an order." Miller's voice was a whip cracking through the dark. She pushed forward, her knees scraping against the rough concrete, her hands raw and bleeding. She could hear it now, a low, bass growl that was rising in pitch, the sound of 10,000 gallons of water being prepped for a high-pressure blast. The pipe began to vibrate, a fine, high-frequency tremor that shook her teeth. "There!" she shouted, spotting a vertical shaft of light 50 yards ahead. They scrambled toward it, their movements desperate and uncoordinated. Elena reached the ladder first, her hands gripping the rungs with a strength born of pure terror. She hauled herself up, then reached down to grab Arya as Miller shoved the girl upward. "Get her up, get her up." Miller screamed. Elena pulled Arya through the opening just as the first wall of water hit. The sound was like a freight train slamming into a mountain. The ladder shuddered, the metal groaning under the weight of the surge. Miller was still halfway down the shaft, his boots dangling over the abyss of rushing water. "Miller!" Elena shrieked, reaching down, her fingers brushing the fabric of his sleeve. The sergeant major looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light of the maintenance room. For a second, the mask of the soldier slipped, and she saw the man, the uncle, the brother, the friend. He wasn't afraid. He was making the choice he had told her about in the bathroom. He was being a man, not a machine. With a violent heave, he grabbed a structural strut and swung himself upward, his boots clearing the shaft just as the water exploded past, a column of white foam and fury that would have crushed a human body to pulp in seconds. He collapsed onto the grated floor, gasping for air, his uniform soaked and his face pale. Elena didn't say a word. She just put her hand on his shoulder and squeezed. He nodded once, the silent acknowledgement of a debt that would never be spoken of again. They were inside. Section 7 was a maze of humming servers and glowing consoles, the brain of the well. The air here was sterile and chilled to exactly 64 degrees, smelling of ionized air and expensive plastic. It was the kind of place where the silence felt like a physical weight, a room designed to make human beings feel small and temporary. "The terminal is in the center," Elena said, her sight narrowing until the world was nothing but a series of interconnected nodes. That's where the link is. If I can get into the root directory, I can sever the connection between the facility's AI and Area's neural signature. What about the guards? Miller asked, checking the magazine of his rifle. There aren't any, Elena said, her eyes fixed on the empty corridors. They don't need guards in here. The facility is the guard. Every floor tile is a pressure plate. Every vent is a gas dispenser. The moment we stepped out of that shaft, the system knew we were here. It's just waiting for instructions. Then let's give it some, a voice said. Elena spun around, her rifle coming up to her shoulder in a single, fluid motion. Standing at the end of the server bank was a woman she recognized, Major Sarah Hauer. She wasn't wearing ops. She was in a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back into a severe bun, a tablet held in her hand like a shield. Behind her stood 4 men in tactical gear, their weapons lowered but their eyes fixed on Elena with the blank, professional gaze of Tier 1 operators. "Captain Vance," Hauer said, her voice echoing in the sterile room. "I've spent the last 48 hours reading your file. You're a remarkable soldier, possibly the best I've ever seen, but you're out of your depth." "I'm exactly where I need to be, Major," Elena said, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Where is Thorne?" "Colonel Thorne is in a hospital bed being erased from history," Hauer said, stepping forward. The tactical team moved with her, a coordinated shadow. "He was a visionary, but he was weak. He thought he could control the asset through observation. We know better. The asset isn't a research subject, Elena. It's a weapon, the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering tool in the history of warfare, and you're currently holding it by the hand." "She's a child," Elena spat. "She's a nexus," Hauer corrected. "She is the only interface capable of processing the data we're pulling from the probability matrix. With her, we don't just react to threats. We see them before they happen. We win the wars of the next century before the first shot is fired. Think about the lives that will save, Captain. Think about the stability it brings to the world." "At what cost?" Elena asked. "You're turning a human being into a processor. You're burning out her brain to play God with the future." "The institution requires sacrifice," Hauer said, her voice softening just a fraction. "You know that better than anyone. Your father knew it. He died for training exercise because he believed the unit mattered more than the man. Are you really going to let his legacy end with you becoming a traitor?" Elena felt the sight flare, a violent, jagged pulse of light that made her knees buckle. She saw the threads connecting Hauer to the terminal. She saw the data stream flowing from Area into the servers. And she saw the truth behind Hauer's words. The woman didn't believe in the mission. She believed in the order. She was the final evolution of the machine, a person who had replaced her soul with a manual. "My father died because he trusted the people in charge to value his life," Elena said, her voice steady. "He was wrong, and so was I, but I'm not wrong about this." She turned her gaze to Area. The girl was standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the main terminal. The violet light was no longer a shimmer. It was a storm, a swirling vortex of energy that was beginning to rattle the server racks. "Area," Elena said, "do it." "No," Hauer shouted, reaching for her tablet, but it was too late. Area didn't move her hands. She didn't shout. She simply opened her mind. The explosion wasn't physical. It was a data surge, a massive, catastrophic overflow of information that hit the facility's network like a lightning strike. The monitors in the room shattered simultaneously, showering the floor in glass. The servers groaned, the cooling fans screaming as they tried to combat the sudden, impossible heat. The tactical team collapsed, clutching their heads, their comms headsets emitting a high-pitched squeal that sounded like dying animals. Hauer fell to her knees, her tablet melting in her hands, her eyes rolling back in her head as the sheer volume of the probability matrix flooded her consciousness. Elena felt it too. It was like her brain was being turned inside out. She saw the past, the present, and every possible future all at once. She saw the rise and fall of empires. She saw the birth of stars. She saw the moment her father died and the moment she would die. It was beautiful and terrible and too much for a human heart to hold. "Area, stop!" she screamed, her voice lost in the roar of the data. "You're going to kill yourself?" The girl turned to her. Her face was a mask of pure light, her features blurred by the intensity of the energy. Asterisk, I have to break the threads. Asterisk, the voice echoed in Elena's mind, but it wasn't a child's voice. It was the voice of the world. Asterisk, if I don't break them, they'll just keep pulling. Asterisk, Area reached out and touched the main terminal. A blinding flash of white light filled the room, followed by a silence so absolute it felt like the end of time. When Elena's vision finally returned, the room was in ruins. The servers were blackened husks, the air thick with the smell of burnt silicon and ozone. Hauer and the tactical team were gone, likely retreated or evacuated during the surge. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic dripping of water from a broken pipe. Elena looked at the floor. Aria was lying there, her body small and fragile against the cold concrete. The violet light was gone. The mercury swirl in her eyes was gone. She looked like a regular 8-year-old girl who had fallen asleep in the middle of a game. Elena crawled to her body feeling like it was made of lead. She checked the girl's pulse. It was there, slow, steady, and human. "Is she?" Miller's voice was a whisper. He was leaning against a server rack, his face covered in soot, his arm hanging at an awkward angle. "She's alive," Elena said, pulling the girl into her lap. "She did it. She burnt out the link. The well is dead." "We need to go," Miller said, coughing. "The backup generators will kick in soon. They'll have the whole facility surrounded by now." "No," Elena said, looking at the door. "They won't. They can't find us anymore." She looked at her own hands. The sight was gone. The threads, the patterns, the probability matrices, all of it had vanished. The world was just a room. The walls were just concrete. The air was just air. She felt a sudden, sharp sense of loss, a mourning for the extraordinary capability that had defined her for so long. But underneath it, there was a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. For the first time in her life, she was just Elena. They walked out of the main entrance of the well 30 minutes later. There were no guards. No helicopters, no wolves. The facility had been scrubbed from the network, its digital existence erased by the surge. To the rest of the world, the well was just a decommissioned silo in the middle of the desert that had suffered a catastrophic electrical failure. They walked into the desert as the sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and fire. The air was warm now, the storm having passed, leaving the world smelling of rain and fresh earth. They found a dirt road 5 miles away. A rusted-out Ford F-150 was parked by a cattle tank, the keys left in the ignition by some rancher who had long since forgotten about it. Miller climbed into the driver's seat, his movements slow and pained, but his eyes were clear. "Where to, boss?" he asked. Elena sat in the passenger seat, Aria curled up between them, her head resting on Elena's leg. She looked out at the vast, open expanse of the American West, a landscape that felt both endless and full of possibility. "West," Elena said, "until we hit the mountains. I hear Montana is beautiful this time of year." The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet towns and cheap motels. They lived on cash and stayed off the interstates. They were ghosts, 3 people who had died in a fuel truck accident at Fort Valor and been reborn in the dust of the Trans-Pecos. The official story held. Captain Elena Vance was listed as deceased, a victim of a mental breakdown and a tragic fire. Sergeant Major Miller was a hero who had died trying to stop her. Aria was a name on a classified file that had been deleted by a cyber attack of unknown origin. The institution had moved on. It had replaced the people, rebuilt the servers, and found a new mission. It was a machine, after all. It didn't have the capacity for regret. In a small cabin outside of Missoula, Montana, the cost of the victory was tallied in the quiet moments of the afternoon. Elena sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range. She was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, her hair long and loose around her shoulders. Her shoulder had healed into a jagged, silver scar, a permanent map of the night she had chosen aside. She couldn't see the threads anymore. When she looked at the trees, she just saw trees. When she looked at the sky, she just saw the sky. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she would wake up and reach for the sight, her mind searching for the patterns that weren't there. The silence in her head was a constant, haunting reminder of what she had given up. She had been a god for a night, and now she was just a woman. But then she would hear the sound of laughter from the kitchen. Aria was sitting at the table, helping Miller with a jigsaw puzzle. The girl was healthy, her face full and her eyes bright. She went to a local school under the name Annie. She liked math and drawing, and she was remarkably good at chess, though she didn't seem to know why. She was a regular girl with regular dreams and a regular future. Miller had found work as a mechanic at a local garage. He was Uncle Jim now, a man who told stories about the desert and fixed tractors with a patience that bordered on the supernatural. He and Elena didn't talk about the army. They didn't talk about the well, they didn't have to. The bond between them was a silent, unbreakable cord, forged in the dark and tempered by the cost of the choice they had made. One evening, after Aria had gone to bed, Miller joined Elena on the porch. He handed her a beer, the bottle cold and sweating in the mountain air. "I saw a news report today," he said, his voice low. "General Vance, the one from the Pentagon, is retiring." Medical reasons, something about a neurological condition. Elena took a sip of the beer, the bitterness a sharp, grounded contrast to the sweetness of the air. The data surge. Hauer wasn't the only one linked to the network that night. Anyone who was plugged into the high-level feed got hit. You think they'll ever come looking? Elena looked at the mountains. She thought about the institution, the vast, impersonal machinery of the world they had left behind. She thought about the wolves and the drones and the probability matrices. They might, she said, but they are looking for a captain and a sergeant major. They're looking for a weapon. They're not looking for us. She looked at her hand, the skin calloused and scarred. She had spent her life serving a flag, a chain of command, a mission. She had believed that her value was defined by what she could do, by the hidden capability that made her extraordinary. She was wrong. Her value was in the choice. It was in the quiet, desperate moments where she had chosen a child over a career, a person over a program, the truth over the order. She had lost her sight, her rank, and her identity. But she had found her soul. She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, the wood creaking under her boots. The stars were coming out now, thousands of tiny, bright points of light in the vast, dark sky. They weren't threads, they weren't data, they were just stars. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Miller was standing beside her, his presence a steady, unwavering anchor. "You okay, Elena?" She looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. It wasn't the controlled, professional smile of a captain. It was the smile of a woman who had finally come home. "I'm fine, Jim," she said. "I'm just fine." She went inside, the screen door clicking shut behind her. The cabin was warm, smelling of wood smoke and the lingering scent of dinner. She walked down the hallway and peered into Aria's room. The girl was fast asleep, her breathing deep and rhythmic. Elena sat on the edge of the bed and brushed a stray lock of hair from Aria's forehead. The girl stirred but didn't wake. In the dim light of the nightlight, Elena thought she saw a faint, momentary shimmer of violet in the girl's hair, a ghost of the power she had once held. Or maybe it was just the light. Elena leaned down and kissed the girl's cheek, then stood up and walked back to the living room. She picked up a book from the coffee table, a worn copy of Asterisk, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius Asterisk that her father had given her when she graduated from West Point. She turned to a passage she had underlined 100 times. Asterisk, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Asterisk, she closed the book and set it back on the table. Her thoughts were no longer colored by the cold, clinical gray of the institution. They were colored by the green of the mountains, the gold of the desert, and the silver of a little girl's laugh. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark woods. She knew that out there, somewhere, the world was still turning. The wars were still being fought. The secrets were still being kept. The machine was still running, indifferent and relentless. But here, in this small, quiet corner of the world, the machine had no power. She was a soldier who had walked away from the war. She was a ghost who had found a life. She was Elena Vance, and for the first time in her 33 years, she knew exactly who she was. She turned off the lamp, the room plunging into a soft, comfortable darkness. She walked to her bedroom, her footsteps light on the wooden floor. She didn't need the sight to find her way. She knew the patterns of this house, the rhythm of this life, the shape of this peace. As she lay down in bed, she felt the weight of the day settle over her, a warm, heavy blanket of exhaustion. She closed her eyes and listened to the sound of the wind in the pines, a low, steady whisper that sounded like a lullaby. The cost had been everything, and it was worth every penny. She fell asleep as the first light of the moon began to touch the window, a pale, silver glow that carried no data, no threads, and no warnings. The next morning, the sun rose over the Bitterroots, casting long, golden shadows across the valley. Elena was up early, as she always was. She made coffee, the smell of the beans filling the kitchen. She stood at the window, watching a pair of elk move across the meadow at the edge of the property. Aria came into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, her hair a tangled mess of blonde curls. "Morning, Annie," Elena said, handing her a glass of orange juice. "Morning, Elena," the girl said, taking a sip. She looked out the window at the elk. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" "They are," Elena said. "I had a dream last night," Aria said, her voice thoughtful. "I dreamed that I was a bird. I could see everything, every leaf, every bug, every breath. It was big." Elena felt a momentary tightening in her chest. "Was it scary?" "No," Aria said, smiling. "It was just a dream. I'm glad I'm not a bird. I'd miss the pancakes." Elena laughed, a sound that felt light and easy in her throat. "Well, in that case, we'd better get started." She spent the morning teaching Aria how to flip a pancake, the kitchen filled with the sound of their chatter and the smell of sizzling batter. Miller came in later, smelling of sawdust and grease, and they sat together at the table, a small, makeshift family bound by a secret that nobody else in the world would ever understand. They were happy, not movie happy, real happy, the kind of happy that knows the price of the peace it enjoys. Later that afternoon, Elena went for a walk in the woods. She followed a narrow trail that led up to a rocky outcropping overlooking the valley. She sat on a boulder, the sun warm on her face, and looked out at the world. She thought about Sarah Hauer. She wondered if the Major was still in the system, still looking for the threads, still trying to find the patterns in the noise. She hoped for Hauer's sake that the surge had broken something inside her too. She hoped that the woman had found a way to be just a person. She thought about her father. She thought about the man he had been and the man she had believed he was. She realized now that he hadn't died for the unit. He had died for her. He had lived his life in the shadow of the flag so that she wouldn't have to. He had given her the strength to be a soldier so that one day she could have the courage to be something else. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver coin, a challenge coin from her time with the 75th Ranger Regiment. She looked at it for a long time, the familiar weight of it in her palm. Then, with a single fluid motion, she threw it as hard as she could. The coin caught the sunlight as it tumbled through the air, a flash of silver against the green of the trees before disappearing into the brush. It was a small gesture, a quiet moment, a final surrender. She walked back down the trail, her heart light and her mind quiet. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. The past was a country she had left behind, and the future was a map she was drawing one day at a time. She reached the cabin as the sun was beginning to set, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple. She saw Miller and Aria on the porch waiting for her. "Hey," Miller called out, waving his hand. "You're back just in time. Annie wants to know if we can have a campfire tonight." "A campfire sounds perfect," Elena said. They spent the evening sitting around the fire, the orange flames dancing in the darkness. They roasted marshmallows and told stories, their voices rising and falling in the quiet mountain air. As the fire began to die down to a bed of glowing embers, Aria leaned her head against Elena's shoulder. "Elena." "Yeah, honey. Do you ever miss it?" Elena looked into the heart of the fire. She thought about the sight. She thought about the thrill of the mission, the clarity of the patterns, the feeling of being the only one in the room who knew the truth. She thought about the uniform and the rank and the certainty of the chain of command. She looked at Miller, who was watching her with a quiet, knowing gaze. Then she looked at Aria, the girl she had saved from a life of being a tool. She felt the warmth of the girl's shoulder against hers. She felt the cool mountain breeze on her face. She felt the steady, rhythmic beating of her own heart. "No," Elena said, her voice a soft, sure vibration in the dark. "I don't miss it at all." She sat there for a long time, watching the embers fade until they were nothing but a faint, red glow in the ashes. The world was quiet. The stars were bright. And for the first time in her life, Elena Vance wasn't waiting for anything to happen. She was just there, she was just alive, and that was more than enough. The next day, she woke up and did it all again. She made the coffee, she made the pancakes. She walked in the woods, she lived her life. It was a quiet life, a small life, a life that nobody would ever write a report about or award a medal for. But it was her life. And as she stood on the porch one final time before going inside for the night, she looked out at the dark, silent mountains and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had been the best soldier in the room, but she was a much better human being. She turned off the porch light and went inside, the door clicking shut with a sound that was final and true. The mission was over. The girl was safe. The threads were broken, and the woman was free. The laundry on the line smelled like mountain air and the wood smoke from the neighbor's chimney.